my in-laws pulled my wife from the burning wreckage of our home and left me pinned under a collapsing ceiling. I thought it was blind panic, and I actually forgave them, until their $5 million insurance claim arrived with my name typed on the dotted line as the arsonist. Her father smiled and told me to sacrifice myself for the family. He thought he was dealing with a disposable nobody. He forgot he was dealing with a forensic accountant. I woke up with my lungs burning. It was 3 a.m. and the air in our bedroom was thick and black. The smoke alarm was screaming, but it sounded distorted, buried under a deep roaring sound that physically shook the floorboards. Our home, the historic Sterling family estate my wealthy father-in-law had supposedly gifted us as a wedding present, was being swallowed by flames. I coughed violently, dragging my heavy body out of bed. The heat was a physical wall slamming into my face. I reached across the mattress, fully expecting to feel Caroline beside me. The sheets were empty. Panic hit me harder than the toxic smoke. I screamed her name, but the sound was instantly swallowed by the crackling roar of the fire consuming the hallway. I am 36 years old. For a decade, I have spent my life as a forensic accountant. I look at spreadsheets, track missing funds, and audit corporate accounts. My entire career is built on finding the truth hidden beneath layers of deception. I analyze risk. I follow the paper trail. But nothing in my logical, structured life had prepared me for the sheer chaotic violence of a massive house fire. The wooden frame of the generational estate was acting like a giant furnace feeding on the dry timber and antique furnishings. I crawled forward on my hands and knees. I kept my face as close to the floor as possible, desperately searching for a pocket of breathable air. Every inhale felt like drawing boiling water into my lungs. I had to find Caroline. We had been married for 5 years. She was the daughter of Richard Sterling, a local real estate titan who always made it perfectly clear that I was a massive disappointment to his bloodline. I was just Nate Gibson. I was a middle-class numbers guy making $80,000 a year. I did not have a trust fund. I did not wear custom-tailored suits or play golf at his exclusive country club. I was an outsider, but I loved his daughter, and I believed she loved me. In that suffocating darkness, my only thought was getting her out alive. The hallway outside the master suite was a horrific tunnel of orange and yellow fire. The vintage wallpaper was peeling off in long, burning strips floating down like toxic snow. I pulled my cotton shirt up over my nose and mouth. I moved blindly toward the guest wing, a separate part of the estate where Caroline often slept when she stayed up late working on her social media campaigns. The floorboards blistered the palms of my hands. Every muscle in my body screamed in protest, but adrenaline forced me forward. I reached the heavy oak door of the guest bedroom. The brass handle was scorching hot, searing the skin right off my palm. I kicked the door open with my shoulder, tumbling roughly into the room. The smoke here was slightly thinner, but the flames were already licking at the edges of the ceiling, threatening to bring the entire roof down. Through the haze, I saw shadows moving near the large bay window. The glass had been smashed completely out from the outside. Cold October night air was rushing in, feeding the fire and making the flames dance wildly. I pushed myself up my vision, blurring from the intense smoke. That is when I saw them. Richard Sterling. My father-in-law was standing on the porch roof just outside the shattered window. Beside him was Trent Caroline's younger brother. Trent was 28, a reckless trust fund kid who had never worked a real day in his life, always covered by Richard's endless money and influence. And there was Caroline. She was coughing, her expensive nightgown covered in dark soot, but she was alive. Richard had a firm grip on her arm. He was pulling her toward the edge of the roof where a tall aluminum ladder was propped against the siding. Relief washed over me so intensely that my knees almost gave out entirely. I stumbled forward, raising my badly burned hand into the air. I yelled for them. I told them I was right behind her. I told Richard to grab my hand next. Richard stopped and turned his head. The flames illuminated his face perfectly in the dark night. There was absolutely no panic in his eyes. There was no urgency. There was only a cold, calculated stare. He looked at me as if I were a stranger who had trespassed on his private property. I stopped moving. The relief instantly morphed into deep, chilling confusion. I yelled his name again, taking another desperate step toward the open window. Trent looked at me, then nervously looked away, shifting his weight on the roof. Trent did not reach out his hand. He did not say a single word to help me. Then a deafening crack echoed right above me. It sounded like a cannon firing inside the small room. The main structural support of the ceiling, a massive antique oak beam that had stood for over 100 years, finally snapped under the intense, relentless heat. I looked up just in time to see the flaming ceiling giving way. I dove toward the open window. I reached desperately for Caroline. I reached for the father-in-law who had always judged me. I reached for any of them. But I was a fraction of a second too late. The heavy burning timber crashed down from above. It slammed directly into my legs with the overwhelming force of a freight train. The sheer weight of it crushed me flat against the floorboards. The physical pain was absolute and blinding. It felt as though my bones were instantly shattered and set on fire simultaneously. I screamed out in pure, unfiltered agony. My hands clawed uselessly at the scorching floorboards. I tried to drag my broken body toward the fresh air, but I was entirely pinned. I looked up at the window, gasping for breath as the heat began cooking my skin. I was barely 10 feet away from safety. I met Richard's eyes again. I begged him to help me. I begged Trent to come inside and lift the beam. Richard did not flinch. He tightened his grip on Caroline. He pushed her firmly toward Trent, instructing his son to get her down the ladder quickly. Then Richard looked back at me one last time. He did not look horrified by what was happening to me. He looked deeply satisfied. He took a step back from the window and disappeared into the darkness, leaving me pinned under a burning beam as the fire rapidly closed in around me. They were intentionally leaving me to die. The thick smoke quickly filled the remaining space in the bedroom. The heat was completely unbearable. My lungs were failing me. The excruciating pain in my crushed legs was dragging me down into dark unconsciousness. I realized in those final fading seconds that my wealthy, powerful in-laws had not just come to save Caroline. They had come to watch me burn. The roaring sound of the fire faded into a dull, distant hum. The bright orange light turned to pitch black. My last conscious thought was not a thought of fear. It was a moment of quiet, terrifying clarity. If by some impossible miracle I actually survived this night, I was going to tear their entire world apart. Then the burning floor beneath me completely collapsed. The structural failure of the second floor did not kill me. It saved my life. As the massive burning oak beam drove me downward, the floorboards beneath us gave way completely. Gravity took over. I plummeted through the flaming void of the first floor and crashed violently into the darkness of the subterranean cellar. The historic estate had an archaic plumbing system that had ruptured early in the blaze. The basement was flooded with 3 feet of freezing, stagnant water. The impact knocked the breath from my lungs, but the icy water instantly extinguished the fire, melting into my clothes and skin. I lay there in the pitch black, submerged in mud and ash, gasping for toxic air, while the inferno raged 20 feet above my head. The cold water was a brutal shock, but it kept me from burning to ash. I dragged my shattered legs through the sludge, clinging to a concrete pillar, as the world above me was reduced to embers. Then the darkness swallowed me completely. I expected to die in that basement. Instead, I woke up to the rhythmic, sterile beeping of a heart monitor. The transition from the chaotic roar of the fire to the clinical quiet of the intensive care unit was jarring. Every single nerve in my body was screaming. My legs and left arm were tightly bound in thick white gauze. The smell of antiseptic and burnt flesh filled my nostrils. I forced my heavy eyelids open, squinting against the harsh fluorescent lights of the hospital room. My throat was raw from the smoke inhalation, making it impossible to speak right away. I turned my head slowly, fully expecting to see my wife leaning over the bed. I expected her to be holding my hand, weeping tears of profound relief. I expected the raw, emotional reunion of two people who had just barely survived a nightmare. That is not what I woke up to. Caroline was sitting in a vinyl visitor chair in the far corner of the room. She was not crying. Her makeup was absolutely flawless. She was wearing a fresh cashmere sweater and a pair of designer slacks, looking as though she had just stepped out of a high-end boutique rather than fleeing a burning building. She was entirely engrossed in her smartphone, scrolling rapidly with her thumb. The glow of the screen illuminated her face, highlighting an expression of deep irritation. She looked exactly like someone stuck in a long line at the airport, completely inconvenienced by the delay. I managed a dry, painful cough to get her attention. Caroline finally looked up from her screen. She did not rush to my side. She did not throw her arms around my neck. She simply let out a long, exasperated sigh and slowly stood up. She walked over to the edge of my hospital bed, keeping a distinct physical distance between us. She looked at my bandaged body with a strange mix of pity and disgust, as if I had ruined her weekend plans. "You are awake," she said flatly, slipping her phone into her expensive leather purse. "The doctors said you have 2nd and 3rd degree burns. You are going to be stuck here for a while." There was no warmth in her voice. There was no trembling relief. It was a status report delivered by a middle manager. I tried to speak to ask her why her father had left me under that burning beam, but only a dry rasp came out. Before I could force the words past my damaged vocal cords, the heavy wooden door of the ICU room swung open. Richard Sterling strode into the room carrying the absolute confidence of a man who owned the building. He was impeccably dressed in a tailored navy suit, smelling faintly of expensive scotch and cedar cologne. He did not look like a man who had narrowly escaped a deadly inferno just hours prior. He looked like a man arriving to close a lucrative real estate deal. Richard walked right past Caroline and approached my bed. He flashed a brilliant practiced smile that did not reach his eyes. He reached out and firmly patted my right shoulder, the only part of my upper body that was not wrapped in burn dressings. "Look at this absolute fighter," Richard announced, his booming voice filling the sterile room. "I told the doctors you were too stubborn to die, Nate. We were terrified, son. Absolutely terrified. The smoke was just too thick. Trent and I could not see a thing after we got Caroline out the window. We thought the entire house had swallowed you whole." He delivered the lie with terrifying ease. I stared at him, remembering the exact moment our eyes had locked through the flames. I remembered the weight of the beam crushing my legs while he stood safely on the roof, making a conscious choice to leave me behind. But as I lay there broken and heavily medicated, I did what I had always done with my wealthy in-laws. I rationalized their behavior. I was a practical man. I told myself that the human brain does terrible things during a crisis. Fire causes blind panic. The smoke had been incredibly thick. Maybe Richard truly believed he could not reach me in time without risking his own daughter. Maybe Caroline was in a state of profound shock, and her cold detachment was just a psychological defense mechanism against the trauma. I desperately needed to believe that the woman I married and the family I married into were not monsters. I gave a weak nod, accepting his excuse. Richard smiled wider, clearly satisfied that I was not going to challenge his heroic narrative. He squeezed my shoulder one last time before turning to his daughter. "We need to get going," Caroline Richard said, checking his gold Rolex. "The insurance adjusters are meeting us at my office in an hour. We have a lot of paperwork to sort through regarding the estate." Caroline nodded eagerly, pulling her designer coat over her shoulders. She looked down at me, offering a tight artificial smile. "Get some rest, Nate. I will have my assistant send over some comfortable clothes for when they finally discharge you." They walked out of the intensive care unit together, leaving the heavy door to click shut behind them. The silence in the room was deafening. I was entirely alone with the steady rhythm of the heart monitor and the agonizing pain radiating through my crushed legs. I tried to close my eyes and force myself back to sleep. I tried to convince myself that they were just handling the logistics of a tragedy, but a cold, chilling dread began to settle in the pit of my stomach. The atmosphere in that hospital room had been completely devoid of human empathy. They had not looked at me like a beloved family member who had miraculously survived a brush with death. They had looked at me like a lingering problem that had unfortunately refused to solve itself. I did not know it yet, but the flames that destroyed our home were only the beginning. The real nightmare was already waiting for me outside those hospital doors. The next 48 hours blurred into a terrifying nightmare of narcotic painkillers and agonizing skin grafts. The intensive care unit was an incredibly solitary place. Nurses rotated in and out around the clock to check my vitals and adjust my intravenous drips, but the uncomfortable vinyl visitor chair in the corner of my room remained completely empty. Caroline did not return to hold my hand or ask how my surgeries went. Richard did not call to check on the man who had almost burned to ash under his roof. My personal phone had completely melted in the inferno, so I had absolutely no way to reach the outside world. I was trapped inside a sterile white box, left alone with the haunting memory of a collapsing ceiling and my father-in-law casually walking away from my desperate pleas for help. On the morning of the third day, the heavy mechanical door to my room finally swung open. I shifted my weight awkwardly, wincing as the fresh medical tape pulled tightly against my blistered skin. I expected to see a surgeon arriving for another painful round of wound cleaning and assessment. Instead, two unfamiliar men walked in wearing serious expressions that instantly changed the temperature of the room. The first man was older, wearing a rumpled gray suit with a heavy silver detective badge clipped to his leather belt. He introduced himself as Detective Miller. The man standing right beside him was dressed in the crisp, dark navy uniform of the State Fire Marshal Office. He was tightly gripping a thick manila folder under his arm. I managed a weak nod, trying to sit up slightly against the stiff hospital pillows. I assumed they were here to take my official statement about the tragedy. I was ready to tell them everything I remembered about the thick black smoke, the collapsed floorboards, and the sheer absolute chaos of the night. I wanted to ask if their teams had figured out what caused the catastrophic electrical failure or the ruptured gas leak that ultimately destroyed our historic home. "We need to ask you a few direct questions about the events of Tuesday night," Mr. Gibson, the fire marshal, said. His voice was completely devoid of any basic human sympathy. He did not pull up a chair or ask a single question about my painful recovery. He stood rigidly at the foot of my bed and opened his folder with deliberate, methodical precision. I cleared my raw, dry throat and told him I would cooperate however I could. "Can you walk us through your current financial situation prior to the blaze?" the detective asked suddenly, crossing his arms over his chest. The question caught me completely off guard. I have spent my entire professional career as a forensic accountant, so I naturally thought in terms of numbers and liabilities on a daily basis. But asking a severely burned victim about his bank accounts mere days after a near-fatal catastrophe felt incredibly bizarre. I told them my finances were perfectly fine. I explained that I made a very comfortable salary analyzing corporate ledgers, and that my wife came from an exceptionally wealthy family, so we had absolutely no mortgage on the massive estate. The fire marshal exchanged a long, unreadable look with the detective. He slowly flipped a page in his heavily documented folder. "Are you absolutely certain about that financial stability, Mr. Gibson? Because the origin point of the fire tells a drastically different story." I stared at him, trying to process his harsh words through the heavy, lingering fog of my pain medication. I asked him what he meant by the origin point. "The blaze did not start in the kitchen or the basement wiring," the fire marshal stated flatly. "The burn patterns and our chemical residue tests were highly conclusive. The fire originated directly inside your personal home office on the ground floor. Specifically, our hazard teams found distinct traces of an industrial-grade chemical accelerant poured aggressively around your wooden desk and your locked filing cabinets." My heart slammed wildly against my ribs. I shook my head, adamantly ignoring the sharp, searing pain shooting up the back of my neck. I told them that was physically impossible. I told them I did not keep any flammable chemicals anywhere near my workspace, and that I was sound asleep upstairs in the master suite when the smoke alarms finally went off. Detective Miller stepped much closer to the side of my bed, pulling a thick stack of photocopied documents from his inside jacket pocket. If your finances were so stable, Nate, why did you secretly open 4 high-limit credit cards in the past 60 days? He dropped the folded papers directly onto my lap. I reached out with my unbandaged right hand, picking up the top sheet with trembling fingers. My forensic accounting brain immediately scanned the bold black numbers printed across the page. The documents were official bank statements registered perfectly to my name and my social security number. The outstanding balances were absolutely staggering. Over $200,000 in cash advances and high-end luxury purchases had been racked up in less than 2 months. The accounts were entirely maxed out and already flagged as severely delinquent. I stared at the financial paperwork in absolute horror. The numbers simply did not make any logical sense. I lived a quiet, meticulously structured life. I drove a practical used sedan, and I invested 30% of my monthly income into safe index funds. I had never seen these specific credit cards before in my entire life. "These are not mine," I said, my voice cracking with rapidly rising panic. "Someone stole my identity. I never authorized these accounts or made these massive withdrawals. You have to believe me." The detective sighed deeply, rubbing the back of his neck like a weary man who had heard this exact desperate excuse 1,000 times before. "We pulled the digital application records this morning, Mr. Gibson. The specific internet routing addresses used to open these lines of credit trace directly back to the secure wireless router located inside your home. The exact same home that you just happened to douse in chemical accelerant when the aggressive collection agencies started calling your phone." The pale walls of the hospital room felt like they were rapidly closing in on me. I struggled to draw oxygen into my damaged lungs as the horrific reality of their accusation finally crashed over me. They were not treating me like a tragic surviving victim who had miraculously escaped a deadly inferno. They were treating me like a desperate, deeply indebted arsonist who had tried to burn down a historic property to magically erase a massive financial nightmare. I looked frantically from the stoic detective to the unblinking fire marshal. I begged them to look deeper into the transactions, to trace the actual purchases, and see that I was entirely innocent. I told them I was a professional auditor and that I would never commit such an obvious, sloppy pattern of financial fraud. People do incredibly reckless and stupid things when they are cornered. The fire marshal replied coldly, snapping his manila folder shut. "We are going to let you rest for now, but you need to deeply understand that the physical and digital evidence we have is completely overwhelming. Do not make any plans to leave the state when the hospital finally discharges you." They turned in unison and walked out of the room, leaving the heavy stack of forged credit card statements resting on my chest. I lay there, shivering uncontrollably despite the thick thermal hospital blankets. My analytical mind raced frantically through the impossible logistics. The chemical accelerant perfectly placed in my private office. The massive debts opened seamlessly under my own secure home network. The cold, calculated stare of my father-in-law as he safely watched the ceiling collapse on top of me. I was not just left behind in that burning house. I had been systematically and meticulously framed. The heavy hospital door clicked shut behind the fire marshal and the detective, leaving me entirely alone with the suffocating realization of my new reality. The police had already tried and convicted me in their minds. I was struggling to process the sheer magnitude of the horrific allegations when the heavy door swung open once again. It had been less than 5 minutes since the authorities vacated the sterile corridor. It was not a nurse arriving to check my vital signs or adjust my pain medication. My father-in-law stepped into the room, accompanied this time by his son Trent. The polished and deeply concerned facade Richard had worn so perfectly during his previous visit was completely gone. He reached behind him and locked the hospital door with a sharp and definitive click. Trent walked in lazily and leaned his back against the pale wall. He was wearing expensive designer sneakers and a custom-fitted jacket, completely unbothered by the clinical and depressing atmosphere of the intensive care unit. He chewed a piece of gum with casual indifference. He did not look at my heavily bandaged legs or the massive gauze wraps covering my raw arms. He looked profoundly bored by my survival. Richard pulled up the uncomfortable vinyl visitor chair and sat down directly next to my bed. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees and clasping his freshly manicured hands together. The silence stretched between us thick and entirely paralyzing before he finally decided to speak. "The commercial real estate market is remarkably unforgiving right now, Nate," Richard began. His tone was casually conversational, as if we were simply discussing interest rates over a Sunday morning round of golf. "My entire portfolio is highly leveraged across the state. The regional banks are aggressively calling in my outstanding loans. The creditors are circling my properties like starving vultures. We were looking at total unavoidable bankruptcy by the end of the upcoming fiscal quarter." I stared at him while my clouded mind struggled to bridge the massive gap between his corporate financial troubles and the fact that I was lying in a hospital bed with severe third-degree burns. Richard saw the desperate confusion in my eyes and offered a highly patronizing smile. "That beautiful historic estate you and Caroline were living in was fully insured for an excess of $5 million, he explained calmly. "I simply needed to liquidate an illiquid asset to save the Sterling family legacy." He gestured vaguely toward his son, leaning against the wall. Trent handled the actual ignition of the structure. He was explicitly supposed to ensure the basement was completely cleared out and the main structural supports were properly compromised so the house would collapse inward. But unfortunately, my son lacks basic attention to detail. That is exactly why the heavy oak floor gave way prematurely and dropped you straight into the flooded cellar instead of burying you in the burning ash. Trent scoffed loudly and rolled his eyes as if botching a massive arson and an attempted murder was merely a minor clerical error on his part. The sheer absolute lack of basic humanity in the room was paralyzing. Richard continued speaking seamlessly, explaining exactly how he had orchestrated the perfect criminal scapegoat. "A tragic and accidental electrical fire yields a long, drawn-out insurance investigation," Richard said smoothly. "The payout can be delayed for years in litigation. But an intentional arson committed by a desperate and financially ruined husband triggers a rapid and highly motivated payout provided the culprit is quickly identified by the local authorities." I tried to push myself upward, ignoring the agonizing fire shooting through my damaged nerve endings. I told him he was clinically insane. I told him I was an experienced forensic accountant and that I would personally tear his forged credit card statements apart in front of a federal grand jury. Richard chuckled softly under his breath. It was a dark and completely humorless sound. "You are just a mid-level numbers guy, Nate. I employ a massive team of elite corporate attorneys and offshore financial fixers who manipulate international tax law for breakfast. I had your personal computer devices mirrored months ago. I deliberately routed those massive credit card applications through your own secure home internet network. I placed the industrial-grade chemical accelerant directly inside your private study. I made sure every single piece of digital and physical evidence leads directly to your doorstep." He leaned in much closer until I could clearly smell the strong peppermint on his breath. His pale eyes were cold and lifeless, devoid of any paternal affection. "Son-in-law, you need to deeply understand your place in the food chain," Richard whispered chillingly. "You came from absolutely nothing. You were a nobody auditing Midwestern supply chains when we graciously brought you into our elevated world. We clothed you and we fed you and we gave you a life you could have never built on your own pathetic merits. It is time to sacrifice yourself for this family. Take the fall." The words hit me harder than the collapsing, burning timber had. He was casually ordering me to accept the blame for a horrific crime that had almost taken my life. "If you accept the blame, you can easily take a plea deal," Richard stated with terrifying and calculated precision. "You do a few years in a minimum security facility. Caroline divorces you quietly without any public spectacle. But if you try to fight us, and if you attempt to play the heroic truth-teller, I will unleash my entire legal team on you. They will bury you under mountains of fabricated evidence and devastating civil suits. The district attorney plays golf with me every single Sunday. He will absolutely ensure you get the maximum sentence of 20 years in a maximum security penitentiary. If you fight us, my lawyers will completely destroy what is left of your pathetic life." Trent laughed out loud, finally pushing off the wall. "Just take the hit, Nate. You always were a massive loser anyway." Richard stood up smoothly and adjusted the lapels of his tailored suit jacket. He looked down at my battered and helpless body with a look of absolute supreme victory. He honestly believed he had me completely cornered. He believed he was talking to a disposable, naive pawn who lacked the financial resources and the backbone to fight a titan of industry. They turned around together and walked out of the intensive care unit without a single backward glance. They left me entirely alone with the rhythmic beeping of the medical monitors. My severe physical pain was instantly eclipsed by a cold and calculating rage. They thought they had perfectly orchestrated my absolute demise. But in their supreme and blind arrogance, they had just handed a complex financial puzzle directly to a man who spent his entire professional life dismantling people exactly like them. The sliding glass doors of the Memorial Hospital opened, expelling me into the biting chill of a late November morning. I had nothing but the clothes on my back, which consisted of a cheap gray sweatsuit a sympathetic nurse had procured from the Lost and Found. My legs felt like they were wrapped in tight burning barbed wire beneath the thick layers of fresh medical gauze. Every single step I took, leaning heavily on a standard aluminum hospital cane, sent a blinding jolt of agony straight up my spinal cord. But the brutal physical torment was absolutely nothing compared to the crushing weight of isolation pressing down on my chest. Richard and Trent had made their sinister threats perfectly clear in the intensive care unit. Yet a foolish, desperate part of my soul still craved a sanctuary. I needed a safe harbor away from the nightmare. I needed the one place where truth and compassion were supposed to be absolute, unshakable pillars. I needed my community church. Grace Fellowship was a sprawling, affluent congregation nestled in the heart of our manicured, upscale suburb. Caroline and I had attended Sunday morning services there for 5 solid years. I had personally balanced the church annual charity ledgers completely free of charge, saving them thousands in consulting fees. I knew the ushers by their first names. I considered these people my extended family. As I limped painfully up the wide concrete steps toward the grand mahogany double doors, I braced myself for an overwhelming wave of pity. I expected sudden gasps of shock at my gruesome injuries. I anticipated the warm, embracing arms of the deacons and the tearful, comforting prayers of the choir members. I thought my visible suffering would immediately validate my innocence. I pushed my bruised shoulder against the heavy wooden doors and stepped into the bustling, brightly lit foyer. The morning service had just concluded, and the grand hall was tightly packed with familiar families clutching coffee cups and weekly bulletins. The exact moment the door clicked shut behind me, the ambient roar of polite conversation completely died. It was not a gradual fading quiet. It was an instant suffocating silence that fell over the entire room like a heavy lead blanket. Dozens of eyes locked onto me simultaneously. I offered a weak, pain-filled smile, expecting at least one person to rush forward to help me balance. Nobody moved a single inch. The stares directed at my heavily bandaged body were not filled with Christian charity or neighborly concern. They were filled with absolute unfiltered revulsion. A woman I had shared Thanksgiving dinners with for half a decade physically pulled her young children behind her legs as I took a trembling step forward. Harsh whispers began to ripple through the cavernous hall, sounding sharp and venomous. That was when I saw the architect of my social execution. Standing near the massive stone baptismal font was my mother-in-law, Beverly Sterling. She was putting on an absolute masterclass in high society manipulation. Beverly was draped in an elegant dark wool coat, clutching a lace handkerchief surrounded by a tight protective circle of the most influential wealthy elders in our congregation. Her eyes were red and dramatically puffy, portraying the perfect, flawless picture of a traumatized, heartbroken mother. I strained my ears over the aggressive murmurs filling the foyer. My forensic accounting brain instantly began piecing together the data points. I caught fragmented pieces of the toxic narrative she had spent the last 72 hours meticulously planting into the minds of every single person I knew. The rumors were devastatingly precise and highly coordinated. I was no longer a victim of a tragic house fire. I was an unhinged, violent gambling addict. I had supposedly racked up hundreds of thousands of dollars in secret offshore debts. According to Beverly, tearful public whispers, my fragile male ego had completely snapped under the crushing financial pressure, and I had purposefully ignited the master suite to collect a massive insurance payout, completely willing to let my beautiful wife burn alive in her sleep. The sheer calculated audacity of the lie literally took my breath away. She had seamlessly weaponized the forged credit card statements Richard had created, turning my entire community into a hostile jury that had already convicted me without a single trial. I desperately tried to speak to raise my voice and defend my shattered honor, but the severe smoke damage in my throat reduced my shout to a pathetic, ragged wheeze. Before I could even attempt to limp across the marble lobby, a tall, imposing figure stepped directly into my path, blocking my way. It was Pastor Miller. He was a man who had sat at my dining table breaking bread, a man who had laughed at my jokes and praised my diligent accounting work for his parish. His face was currently set in a mask of rigid, righteous anger. He did not extend his hand to greet me. He did not offer a single word of prayer for my ruined, crushed legs. He stepped uncomfortably close, towering over my hunched frame, lowering his voice so only I could hear the absolute chilling finality in his words. "You have an incredible amount of nerve showing your face in this holy place." "Nate," the pastor muttered, his tone dripping with profound disgust. "The Sterling family has been incredibly generous and deeply vital to this ministry. Caroline is completely devastated. She is terrified of you. What you did to her, the secret double life you lived, the sheer selfish depravity of lighting that match it, is completely beyond human forgiveness right now." I leaned heavily on my aluminum cane, my knuckles turning entirely white from the strain. I begged him to listen to basic logic. I pleaded with him to look at the severe, horrific burns covering my body and ask himself why Richard and Trent had walked away completely unscathed without a single scratch. I told him I was framed by a family drowning in corporate debt. I told him the very people standing across the room receiving his comfort had intentionally left me pinned under a burning ceiling to die. Pastor Miller shook his head slowly, a look of profound, patronizing pity crossing his stern features. "Please do not make this any uglier than it already is," he said, taking a firm step back and gesturing forcefully toward the exit. "Beverly warned us you would try to spin a paranoid, violent delusion to save your own skin. I am asking you to leave these sacred premises immediately, Nate. If you refuse to walk out those doors right now, I will have the security deacons physically remove you, and I will gladly call the police to report a hostile trespasser." I stood there paralyzed by the sheer crushing weight of the social injustice. I looked past the pastor broad shoulder and locked eyes directly with Beverly. The grieving, weeping mother routine vanished for a split second. A cold, victorious, arrogant smirk flashed across her perfectly painted lips. She knew she had completely won the narrative war. They had not just stolen my financial stability, my home, and my physical health. They had utterly destroyed my personal reputation, systematically poisoning the well of my entire social existence. The people I had proudly called my friends were glaring at me like I was a convicted monster. I swallowed the bitter metallic taste of absolute betrayal, turned my battered body around, and limped back out into the freezing, unforgiving November rain. The freezing rain was coming down in relentless heavy sheets by the time I pushed through the heavy glass doors of Grace Fellowship. The cold November wind instantly bit through my thin gray hospital sweatsuit. Every single step across the wet pavement sent blinding flares of pain straight up my badly burned legs. I was clutching a small plastic bag holding my charred wallet and a single change of clothes. That pathetic plastic bag represented my entire net worth at this exact moment in time. The affluent congregation members were quickly filtering out behind me, hurrying to their warm luxury vehicles while completely ignoring my physical existence. I was just trying to navigate the slick asphalt without collapsing when I finally saw her. Caroline was standing near the far edge of the VIP parking area, perfectly sheltered under a massive black golf umbrella. She was not looking at me with the tearful, desperate regret of a traumatized spouse who had just lost her own home. She was casually inspecting her flawless manicure while waiting for the valet to bring her vehicle around to the front. I forced my ruined body to move faster, dragging my stiff right leg against the abrasive wet concrete. I called out her name. The sound was barely a raspy whisper against the roaring wind, but she clearly heard me. Caroline slowly turned her head. There was absolutely zero shock or relief on her beautifully painted face. She had completely anticipated this inevitable encounter. I finally reached her, gasping for breath as the cold rain matted my hair flat against my forehead. I stared deeply into the hazel eyes of the woman I had slept next to for 5 long years. I searched frantically for any microscopic trace of guilt or hesitation or basic human remorse. There was absolutely nothing to be found. Her gaze was as hard and impenetrable as a polished diamond. Right behind her, a valet pulled up in a pristine, brand-new white Mercedes-Benz sedan. The temporary dealer plates were still bolted securely to the rear bumper. Richard had clearly wasted no time spending the massive initial insurance advance he had secured. "Caroline," I choked out, leaning all of my exhausted weight onto my cheap aluminum hospital cane. "You know the absolute truth about what happened that night. You were completely awake in that guest room when the roaring fire started. You saw your father and Trent standing on that roof. You watched them intentionally leave me pinned under that burning oak beam." I coughed violently, tasting the lingering foul ash deep inside my damaged lungs. "You cannot honestly let your family do this to me, Caroline. They are aggressively trying to send me to a federal penitentiary for 20 long years. They are telling our entire community that I tried to murder you for an insurance payout. Please just walk into the police station and tell them the actual factual truth." She did not flinch or look away out of shame. She did not even attempt to lower her voice to hide our intimate conversation from the lingering, wealthy churchgoers. She looked at my soaked, cheap clothing and my thick medical bandages with profound, overwhelming distaste. She reached a manicured hand into her expensive leather handbag and pulled out a thick yellow manila envelope. She shoved it forcefully against my chest, forcing me to drop my plastic hospital bag into a deep, muddy puddle just to catch it. "I absolutely do not care about your desperate little fairy tales, Nate," she said, her voice ringing out sharp and incredibly steady. "My brilliant father is handling a massive corporate restructuring process right now. He is under an immense amount of financial pressure to protect the pristine Sterling family legacy. Do you honestly think I am going to jeopardize my entire wealthy future just to blindly defend a man who cannot even afford to buy me a decent pair of designer shoes?" I stood there completely paralyzed by her sheer sociopathic honesty. "You are actively letting your father frame an innocent man for a violent arson," I whispered, my logical mind completely breaking under the immense weight of her cruel betrayal. "I am permanently covered in third-degree burns because your family happily used me as a disposable sacrificial lamb for a $5 million insurance payout." Caroline rolled her perfectly hazel eyes, letting out a dramatic sigh of supreme majestic annoyance. She stepped much closer to the sleek new vehicle, entirely unfazed by my visible physical agony. She looked me up and down one final time, analyzing my broken, pathetic state with the cold, brutal calculation of a predatory investor permanently liquidating a highly toxic asset. "I married an auditor making $80,000 a year, Nate. My father is a visionary. I am not going down with a loser." She turned her back on me completely, sliding gracefully into the plush leather driver's seat of the expensive luxury sedan. The heavy reinforced car door slammed shut with a solid, definitive thud, permanently cutting off any further debate or desperate pleas. I hit the wet pavement forcefully with my aluminum cane, begging her to open the tinted window. I struck the reinforced glass with my raw knuckles, screaming her name through the pouring, heavy rain. Caroline adjusted her rearview mirror, checking her pristine lipstick before she shifted the powerful vehicle into drive and pressed her foot firmly down on the gas pedal. The massive engine roared to life, sending a thick, dirty spray of cold, muddy water directly across my heavily bandaged shins. I stood perfectly still and watched the glowing red taillights of the pristine Mercedes disappear down the tree-lined avenue, merging seamlessly into the wealthy Sunday suburban traffic. I was left completely, utterly alone in the dead center of the vast, empty church parking lot. The freezing downpour quickly soaked right through the thin paper of the heavy manila envelope I was clutching desperately against my shivering chest. I did not even need to tear open the sealed package to instinctively know what it held. It contained heavily expedited divorce papers meticulously drafted by Richard and his elite corporate legal team, designed to strip me of any remaining marital rights. The machinery of the American justice system is notoriously famous for grinding at an agonizingly slow pace for the average citizen. But when you inject millions of dollars and deep political connections into that exact same system, it suddenly operates with the terrifying velocity of a bullet train. I had barely secured a moldy room in a cheap highway motel using the absolute last of my pocket cash when the endless barrage of legal summons began to arrive. Process servers pounded on my flimsy door at all hours of the day and night, delivering thick stacks of aggressive litigation. Richard had unleashed a sprawling army of elite corporate attorneys. They filed a massive coordinated assault against me across multiple different jurisdictions simultaneously. There were civil suits for property damages, emergency divorce filings demanding absolute total forfeiture of assets, and the looming shadow of severe criminal indictments. I was a physically broken man leaning heavily on an aluminum cane trying to navigate a legal slaughterhouse. When I finally limped into the county courthouse for the preliminary hearings, the sheer absurdity of the power dynamic was put on full public display. Richard and Caroline were seated behind a polished oak table flanked by 5 expensive lawyers wearing custom-tailored suits and arrogant smiles. Caroline was performing the role of the terrified, abused spouse with absolute theatrical perfection, clutching a crumpled tissue and completely refusing to even look in my direction. On my side of the dreary courtroom, I sat entirely alone next to an overworked, deeply exhausted public defender named Greg. Greg was handling 70 different cases that week. His cheap suit was wrinkled, and he spent the entire morning frantically shuffling through my file, looking as though he was reading the catastrophic details for the very first time. He was a thoroughly defeated man fighting a completely unwinnable war against a billionaire juggernaut. The lead attorney for the Sterling family stood up and methodically presented the heavily fabricated financial evidence to the stern-faced judge. He laid out the completely forged credit card statements showing over $200,000 in fake luxury debt. He presented perfectly manipulated digital logs falsely proving that the accounts were opened directly from my personal home office network. As a forensic accountant, I sat there listening to this absolute garbage, knowing exactly how easily I could dismantle their sloppy digital footprints if I merely had access to a computer and a basic subpoena. But I had nothing. My public defender did not have the resources, the funding, or the basic accounting knowledge to challenge their massive mountain of highly manufactured paper. Greg simply sat there silently, nodding along as Richard lawyers meticulously painted me as a financially ruined degenerate who had completely lost his mind under the crushing weight of hidden gambling debts. The civil destruction was absolutely brutal, but the true knockout blow came from the criminal division. Richard did not just control the narrative in the local community. He had deep entrenched financial ties to the political infrastructure of the entire county. The local district attorney was a man who regularly attended Richard-exclusive weekend charity galas and heavily relied on Sterling campaign contributions. This prosecutor personally stepped into the courtroom to present the felony arson charges against me. He aggressively detailed how the fire investigator had found industrial accelerant perfectly placed around my desk. He spun a horrific cinematic tale of a desperate husband attempting to burn his own wife alive to collect a $5 million insurance payout and magically erase his secret financial ruin. The district attorney looked directly at the judge and demanded the absolute maximum penalty allowed by state law. He was threatening me with a staggering 20-year sentence in a maximum security penitentiary, During a brief recess, my public defender pulled me into a cramped, windowless consultation room down the hall. Greg looked at my heavily bandaged arms and let out a long, heavy sigh of total resignation. He told me the honest, brutal truth about how the American legal system actually functions when you are fighting against unlimited generational wealth. He explained that we absolutely did not have the hundreds of thousands of dollars required to hire independent forensic experts to disprove the digital banking logs. We did not have the capital to hire private fire investigators to counter the official state reports. Greg looked me dead in the eye and plainly stated that if we took this case to a jury trial, Richard would happily purchase every single expert witness required to bury me alive. The political pressure was completely insurmountable. The local judge was clearly complicit in the aggressive railroading. If I fought them, I was absolutely guaranteed to spend the next 2 decades behind thick iron bars. The ultimatum they placed on the table was utterly devastating, but mathematically calculated to force my absolute surrender. The district attorney offered a highly conditional plea arrangement. If I immediately signed the divorce papers, surrendering every single asset and completely accepted full financial liability for the property damages, they would miraculously drop the attempted murder and felony arson charges down to a minor, reckless endangerment misdemeanor with 0 jail time. I was completely trapped in a perfectly designed legal vice. My physical body was still actively healing from severe third-degree burns. My lungs still ached with every single breath. I simply did not have the physical or mental stamina to survive 20 years in a violent prison environment. I walked slowly back into the silent courtroom, heavily dragging my stiff, injured leg across the polished marble floor. I looked directly across the wide aisle at Richard. The patriarch of the Sterling family was leaning back comfortably in his chair, wearing a chilling, deeply satisfied smirk. He knew he had completely won. He had successfully manipulated the entire justice system to clean up his own massive financial crimes and officially pinned the entire fiery catastrophe squarely onto my shoulders. With a trembling right hand and a completely hollowed-out soul, I took the heavy black pen from my defeated public defender. I signed my name on the dotted line, officially pleading guilty to a nightmare I did not create. I swallowed my pride, my dignity, and my truth, strictly to preserve my basic physical freedom, completely surrendering to the crushing weight of their absolute corruption. The ink flowing from the heavy fountain pen felt like a physical drain on my own lifeblood. I sat in the sterile, aggressively air-conditioned conference room of the downtown courthouse, completely cornered by the most expensive legal predators money could buy. I watched my signature loop across the bottom of the final settlement document, legally binding me to an absolute nightmare. The plea deal was the ultimate illusion of mercy. In exchange for the local prosecutor reducing a fabricated 20-year felony arson sentence down to a minor reckless endangerment charge, I was forced to voluntarily surrender the entire foundation of my adult life. Caroline sat directly across the polished mahogany table from me. She looked radiant, completely untouched by the horrific trauma she claimed had ruined her life. Her sharp corporate attorney, a man who charged more by the hour than I used to make in a week, slid the asset forfeiture agreement toward me. The terms were brutally, explicitly designed to leave me destitute. Caroline demanded every single penny I had ever earned as direct restitution for her severe emotional distress. She took my primary checking accounts. She claimed my emergency savings, which I had painstakingly built over a decade of disciplined, frugal living. She even legally seized my entire retirement portfolio, successfully arguing that my alleged criminal actions had permanently damaged her future financial security. I sat there in stunned, silent agony as I was legally forced to push the keys to my reliable 10-year-old sedan across the table. Caroline did not even need my car. She was already driving a brand new luxury vehicle purchased with the insurance company advance. She took my vehicle simply because she had the power to do it and because forcing me to walk out of that courthouse on foot was the ultimate assertion of her dominance. She looked at the car keys resting on the wood and offered a faint, dismissive scoff, as if collecting my life savings was merely a tedious administrative chore. But the absolute worst part of the settlement was not what they took away from me. It was what they forced me to keep. Richard stepped forward from the shadows of the conference room holding a separate, beautifully embossed leather folder. He placed it directly in front of my bandaged hands with a chilling, theatrical gentleness. Inside the folder was the original property deed to the sprawling historic estate. The exact same property that had burned to the ground while he watched me get crushed under a flaming oak beam. The legal document officially and irrevocably transferred sole ownership of the land directly into my name, free and clear of any external encumbrances. For a brief fleeting second, my exhausted mind was entirely confused. Why would a ruthless billionaire real estate mogul intentionally give away acres of prime suburban land to a man he despised? Richard leaned over the table, placing his expensive, manicured hands flat against the mahogany surface. His voice dropped to a low, smooth whisper that only I could clearly hear over the rustling papers of his legal team. "You are going to take this land, Nate," Richard said, his pale eyes locked onto mine with predatory amusement. "And you are going to take it because that is the absolute mandatory condition of your freedom. The district attorney will only accept your misdemeanor plea if you take full, undisputed ownership of the disaster site." He pulled a separate laminated document from his jacket pocket and placed it delicately on top of the property deed. It was an official urgent citation from the Federal Environmental Protection Agency. I scanned the terrifying bold print. The historic estate had been constructed over a century ago using heavy asbestos insulation, lead-based paints, and highly toxic chemical sealants. When Trent ignited the inferno, the massive structure did not just burn to the ground. It collapsed into a highly hazardous chemical wasteland. The local municipality and the federal government had officially classified the charred remaining debris as a severe biohazard. The mandatory environmental cleanup process required specialized removal crews, hazardous waste permits, and deep soil excavation. The estimated out-of-pocket cost to simply clear the rubble and avoid aggressive daily city fines was a staggering $150,000. That is when the sheer brilliant evil of his legal strategy finally clicked into place. Richard had successfully orchestrated the perfect corporate crime. He was going to quietly collect the $5 million insurance payout for the total loss of the main physical structure. But he completely refused to pay the astronomical environmental cleanup fees required to deal with the toxic aftermath. By forcing the property deed entirely into my name as part of the criminal plea arrangement, he legally shifted the entire burden of the hazardous waste directly onto my shoulders. He was utilizing the local justice system to use me as his personal toxic dumping ground. "If you refuse to sign that deed, my son-in-law, the felony arson charges will be immediately reinstated," Richard whispered, stepping back and straightening his flawless silk tie. "You can either spend the next 2 decades rotting in a maximum security prison cell, or you can take ownership of your mess and deal with the government fines on your own time. The choice is entirely yours." I looked down at my badly burned hands. My skin was tight, painful, and screaming for rest. I had zero financial resources to fight a prolonged trial. I had absolutely no money to hire an independent environmental lawyer. I was entirely beaten, broken, and structurally dismantled by a family that viewed human beings as disposable corporate assets. I picked up the heavy fountain pen one last time. My hand shook violently as I signed my name perfectly on the bottom of the property deed. The lawyers immediately gathered the paperwork, snapping their briefcases shut with swift, terrifying efficiency. Caroline stood up, brushing an invisible speck of dust from her cashmere coat. She walked out of the room without looking back, without saying a single word of goodbye to the man who had almost died trying to save her from a burning room. I was the very last person to leave the courthouse that bleak, rainy afternoon. I pushed through the heavy glass revolving doors and stepped out into the freezing wind. I did not have $1 in my pocket to call a taxi. I did not have a car waiting in the parking garage. I did not have a home to return to or a wife waiting for me. I was officially legally bankrupt. I was entirely homeless. And I was the sole legal owner of a massive, highly toxic pile of wet gray ashes. I had hit absolute total rock bottom, but as the freezing rain washed over my bandaged skin, I realized that when you have absolutely nothing left to lose, you become the most dangerous man in the room. The November wind cut through the thin nylon walls of my discounted camping tent like a jagged sheet of ice. I had pitched the flimsy green shelter on the far eastern edge of the property, right where the manicured lawn met the sprawling black footprint of the burnt estate. It was the only patch of grass that was not completely saturated with toxic ash and chemical runoff. My entire worldly possessions now consisted of a cheap sleeping bag, a plastic flashlight, and 3 cans of baked beans I had purchased with the loose change I found at the bottom of my hospital bag. The temperature was dropping rapidly as the true harshness of the impending winter settled over the wealthy suburb. I lay on the frozen ground, pulling the synthetic sleeping bag tightly around my shivering shoulders. Every single time I shifted my body, the healing skin grafts on my legs stretched and screamed in pure, unfiltered agony. The cold was a relentless physical predator attacking the sensitive damaged nerve endings hidden beneath my thick gauze bandages. I was a 36-year-old man with a degree in forensic accounting, and I was currently living exactly like a feral stray animal. The absolute totality of my financial ruin was difficult for my logical brain to fully process. Caroline and her elite corporate lawyers had meticulously drained every single checking and savings account tied to my name. My credit score was thoroughly obliterated by the massive forged debts Richard had deliberately assigned to my identity. I could not rent a cheap motel room because my debit cards were completely frozen, and I had absolutely zero cash reserves. The local shelters in the neighboring county were filled to capacity, and I frankly lacked the physical strength to walk the 10 miles required to reach them. I was legally mandated to remain in the area while the misdemeanor plea deal was processed through the sluggish county court system. So I returned to the only piece of land I officially owned. I returned to the massive hazardous waste site that Richard Sterling had gleefully forced upon me. Dinner consisted of cold beans eaten straight out of the metal tin with a plastic spoon. I chewed the bland food slowly, forcing my raw throat to swallow the meager calories. The smell of the burnt historic timber still lingered heavily in the damp night air, serving as a constant, suffocating reminder of the night I was left to die. I looked out through the mesh window of the tent, staring at the twisted, blackened skeleton of the once majestic family home. My analytical mind could not stop organizing the sheer devastation into columns of numbers and liabilities. I was staring at $150,000 in mandatory environmental cleanup fees. I was staring at a completely ruined professional reputation that would ensure I never worked in corporate auditing ever again. I was staring at the absolute literal ashes of my marriage and my entire adult life. The quiet isolation of the dark property was suddenly shattered by the aggressive roaring sound of a high-performance engine. Bright white halogen headlights swept across the wet grass, casting long, terrifying shadows over the charred debris. I tensed my broken body instantly, preparing for another visit from the local police or the aggressive city code enforcers who loved to issue me daily citations for the hazardous rubble. But the vehicle that aggressively hopped the curb and parked mere feet from my fragile nylon tent was not a municipal cruiser. It was a brand new custom black Porsche sports car. The heavy driver door swung open and Trent stepped out into the freezing night air. My former brother-in-law was wearing a thick tailored wool coat and a heavy cashmere scarf, looking entirely insulated from the bitter cold. He left the powerful engine running and the warm interior cabin lights glowing, showcasing the absolute luxury of his sheltered existence. Trent walked slowly toward my pathetic campsite, holding a greasy paper bag from an expensive local burger franchise. He looked around the devastated, toxic landscape and then looked down at my shivering form huddled inside the cheap green tent. A cruel, highly amused smile spread across his privileged face. He took a massive bite out of a thick cheeseburger, chewing loudly and deliberately while maintaining direct eye contact with me. I sat up slowly, ignoring the searing pain shooting through my bandaged legs. I did not say a single word. I simply watched him perform his arrogant theatrical display of supreme dominance. "Look at this absolute tragic mess," Trent said, his voice dripping with condescension and pure malicious joy. "My father told me you actually signed the legal deed, Nate, but I truly had to drive down here and see it with my own 2 eyes. I honestly did not believe even a pathetic loser like you would actually set up a camp in the middle of a literal biohazard zone. You look like a frightened little rat hiding in the garbage." He laughed out loud, a harsh grating sound that echoed over the quiet suburban street. He took one final bite of his expensive meal and casually tossed the remaining half-eaten burger directly at my face. The greasy meat and soggy bread hit the thin mesh window of my tent, leaving a disgusting smear of mustard and dirt before falling into the wet mud. "Trash living right inside the trash," Trent mocked, taking a step back toward his warm luxury vehicle. "You really should have just stayed in that burning basement, Nate. It would have saved us a lot of tedious legal paperwork. Enjoy the winter freeze, you absolute nobody." He slid smoothly back into the heated leather seat of his sports car and slammed the heavy door. The tires spun aggressively, tearing up deep chunks of my frozen lawn before the vehicle sped away down the dark road. I sat perfectly still inside my freezing tent, staring at the ruined food sitting in the mud. The sheer, absolute humiliation of the moment was designed to completely break my spirit. They wanted me to crawl away and disappear into the forgotten cracks of society. They wanted me to internalize my own total worthlessness. But as I sat there shivering in the brutal cold, wiping the freezing rain from my face, a different kind of sensation began to take root deep inside my chest. It was not sorrow, and it was definitely not defeat. It was a cold, calculating clarity. I was a man who analyzed numbers and tracked hidden truths for a living. I had survived a collapsing ceiling and a coordinated legal slaughter. I looked at the twisted metal wreckage of the basement foundation in the distance. The intense physical pain and the bitter humiliation were no longer crushing me. They were slowly forging me into something entirely new. I pulled my cheap sleeping bag tighter and stared into the dark, waiting patiently for the morning light. The morning light broke across the ruined estate, revealing the absolute massive scale of my new prison. It was a bleak gray dawn that offered zero warmth and zero comfort. Before I could even crawl out of my freezing nylon tent, a white municipal truck slowly pulled up to the curb. A city code enforcement officer stepped out wearing a thick, high-visibility jacket. He did not look at me with any sympathy. He simply marched over to the scorched wrought iron gate and aggressively stapled a bright yellow citation directly to the metal. As soon as his truck disappeared down the street, I limped over to read the heavy black text. It was an official notice of hazardous blight. I was being fined $250 for every single day the toxic debris remained unmitigated. The local government was demanding specialized environmental removal teams, but I literally had $0 to my name. If the fines piled up, the state would eventually issue a warrant for my arrest for gross environmental negligence. Richard had engineered this perfectly. He knew I could not afford a professional crew, and he fully expected the municipal authorities to finish the job of burying me. I had absolutely no choice but to face the massive toxic graveyard with my own 2 bare hands. I walked 2 agonizing miles to a dilapidated local hardware store on the edge of the county line. I traded the expensive titanium wristwatch I had miraculously managed to slip into my pocket before the fire for a rusted wheelbarrow, a heavy sledgehammer, some thick leather work gloves, and a box of industrial garbage bags. The store owner looked at my burned face and gave me a wide berth, not asking a single question. I dragged the heavy tools all the way back to the ruined estate, pulling my stiff right leg through the accumulating winter slush. The physical labor was an absolute waking nightmare. The massive structural beams of the historic house had collapsed into a dense, tangled web of charred wood, shattered slate roof tiles, and twisted steel plumbing pipes. I started at the outer perimeter, gripping the heavy wooden handle of the sledgehammer with my bandaged hands. Every single time I swung the heavy iron head into the blackened rubble, the thick medical gauze wrapping my arms pulled painfully against my fresh skin grafts. The friction felt like someone was repeatedly pouring boiling water directly over my raw nerve endings. The toxic gray ash billowed up into the freezing air, coating my sweat-soaked clothes and burning my eyes. I was physically moving mountains of hazardous waste, one agonizing wheelbarrow load at a time, dragging the heavy debris to the far corner of the lot just to clear a narrow path. The brutal, exhausting rhythm of the heavy labor should have completely broken my spirit. Every time the iron sledgehammer connected with the charred concrete, an invasive memory violently flashed behind my eyes. With one heavy smash, I saw Richard looking at me through the flames with that calm, predatory satisfaction. With another brutal strike, I heard the local pastor aggressively ordering me to leave the church sanctuary like a diseased outcast. With a final, exhausting swing, I felt the cold, wet mud splashing against my legs as Caroline drove away in her pristine new luxury sedan. Her cruel, venomous words looped endlessly inside my head like a scratched audio tape. I am not going down with a loser. She had traded my life for a new car and a clean public image. She had looked at the man who had crawled through a blazing inferno to save her and decided he was nothing more than a convenient disposable liability. For the first 3 days, I wept while I worked. Hot, bitter tears streamed down my soot-covered face, mixing with the toxic dust. I was grieving the complete annihilation of my entire existence. But on the 4th afternoon, as the freezing sleet began to aggressively coat the massive piles of debris, something deep inside my core fundamentally shattered. I dropped the heavy sledgehammer onto the frozen ground and fell hard onto my bruised knees. I waited for the familiar wave of crushing despair to wash over me. I waited for the pathetic, hopeless sobs to tear from my throat. But the tears did not come. The deep well of my profound sorrow had completely run dry. In its place, a terrifying, freezing calm slowly washed over my exhausted mind. The heavy, suffocating fog of self-pity instantly evaporated. I was entirely done crying over people who had happily watched me burn. I slowly stood back up, wiping the freezing rain from my scarred face. I stopped looking at the devastated property like a victim mourning a lost home. The deep, chaotic emotions completely shut down. The clinical, hyper-analytical brain of a senior forensic accountant suddenly snapped fully awake. I was a man who spent 60 hours a week hunting down missing corporate assets, dismantling shell companies, and discovering the deliberate hidden flaws in complex financial networks. I took a slow, deep breath of the harsh winter air and began to aggressively survey the ruined landscape through a completely different lens. I stopped swinging the sledgehammer blindly out of pure, helpless rage. I started working with a meticulous, calculated strategy. I began mentally sectioning the vast property into a logical, organized grid, just like a massive, tangled spreadsheet. As I systematically cleared away the heavy layers of the collapsed first floor, I started noticing glaring physical inconsistencies. Richard had claimed that Trent was entirely responsible for prepping the house for the insurance fire. Trent was specifically supposed to clear out the heavy structural supports and empty the subterranean levels so the fire would completely consume the foundation. But Trent was an incredibly lazy, arrogant amateur. He had botched the ignition sequence, and he had clearly cut corners on the physical preparation. I stared down into the massive gaping crater where the grand living room used to sit. The heavy oak floor had collapsed exactly where I had fallen that night, plunging into the flooded basement. The water had long since drained away, leaving a thick layer of frozen sludge. But as I carefully calculated the load-bearing trajectory of the remaining debris, I realized that the deepest southern corner of the subterranean cellar was completely untouched by the extreme heat of the primary blaze. Trent had totally failed to clear the lower levels. The realization hit my system like a massive shot of adrenaline. The ruthless elite family had successfully stripped me of my money, my reputation, and my wife. They thought they had buried a helpless, gullible nobody under a mountain of toxic ash. But as I grabbed my shovel and began methodically digging toward that untouched corner of the basement, I was no longer the prey. I was the auditor, and it was time to deeply investigate the Sterling family accounts. The brutal physical labor transformed from a desperate struggle for survival into a meticulous forensic excavation. I completely abandoned the chaotic, angry swinging of the heavy sledgehammer. Instead, I mapped out the blackened footprint of the historic estate in my mind, dividing the collapsed architecture into a highly structured grid. I approached the devastation exactly how I would approach a massive, corrupted corporate ledger. I needed to isolate the anomalies. I needed to find the specific areas where the official narrative provided by the fire marshal fundamentally contradicted the physical reality resting on the frozen ground. I focused my entirely exhausted body on the deepest southern corner of the subterranean cellar. This was the exact flooded pocket of the foundation where gravity had violently dragged my broken body on the night of the inferno. The extreme heat of the primary blaze had raged ferociously through the upper massive floors, completely vaporizing the antique furniture and the expensive artwork. But when the massive structural beams gave way, the entire weight of the burning house had crashed downward, sealing off this specific corner of the basement. The sheer volume of the collapsed slate roof and the heavy plaster walls had acted as an unintended thermal shield. The freezing water from the ruptured plumbing mains had pooled deeply in this concrete depression, completely insulating the lower foundation from the catastrophic temperatures above. I gripped the wooden handle of my rusted shovel, my breath pluming in the bitter November air. The biting wind whipped across the empty lot, but I barely felt the freezing cold anymore. The intense physical pain radiating from my healing skin grafts was entirely eclipsed by a singular burning focus. I drove the metal spade deep into the thick layer of frozen gray ash and hardened black mud. Every single shovel load weighed an absolute ton. My back ached with a deep, agonizing throb, and my raw hands bled freely against the rough leather of my cheap work gloves. I dug relentlessly for 5 straight hours, clearing away a massive mountain of shattered brick and twisted copper piping. The afternoon sun was beginning to dip below the barren tree line, casting long, haunting shadows across the toxic wasteland. I raised the heavy shovel and drove it downward with every ounce of remaining strength I possessed. A sharp, distinctive metallic clang echoed loudly through the desolate property. The vibration shot violently up the wooden handle and instantly rattled the bones in my forearms. I froze in place. I knew the familiar sound of a shovel striking a loose iron pipe or a standard piece of residential ductwork. This noise was fundamentally different. It was the dense, heavy, unyielding sound of a tool striking solid structural steel. I dropped the shovel onto the frozen ground and fell directly onto my bruised knees. I completely ignored the toxic sludge seeping through my cheap gray sweatpants. I used my thickly gloved hands to aggressively claw away the remaining layers of hardened mud and wet ash. My fingers desperately scraped against a smooth, flat surface buried deep within the concrete floor. I brushed away a thick layer of soot, revealing a dull, metallic gray finish. I kept digging, my breathing growing incredibly shallow and incredibly fast. I uncovered a massive, reinforced steel hinge. Then I unearthed a heavy industrial locking mechanism. Finally, I cleared enough of the debris to reveal a thick, circular combination dial. It was not a standard residential lockbox. It was a massive commercial-grade structural vault perfectly integrated directly into the thick concrete foundation of the estate. I sat back on my heels, staring down at the massive steel door, completely stunned by the sheer magnitude of the discovery. I recognized the manufacturer logo faintly embossed on the heavy steel plating. It was a high-end fireproof and waterproof foundation safe designed explicitly to survive catastrophic structural collapses and extreme thermal events. This was Richard Sterling's private personal vault. My analytical mind immediately began racing, processing the staggering implications of this unburnt steel box. Richard was a man of absolute terrifying precision when it came to his complex financial crimes. He had meticulously forged credit card applications, he had expertly bribed local political officials, and he had seamlessly framed an innocent man for a violent felony. A man with that level of ruthless calculation would never intentionally leave a vault containing his most sensitive corporate secrets, buried underneath a highly investigated demolition site. He would have demanded the property be completely sanitized of any real liabilities before the first drop of chemical accelerant was ever poured. The entire burden of preparing the house for the insurance fire had been explicitly delegated to his son. I looked at the heavy steel door, and a cold, victorious realization washed over my exhausted mind. Trent was supposed to completely empty the estate. Trent was tasked with clearing out the basement and sanitizing the physical footprint. But Trent was fundamentally lazy. He was a spoiled, arrogant heir who had never completed a hard day of physical labor in his entire pampered life. I could vividly picture the sequence of events in my head. Trent had likely grabbed the easy, lightweight valuables from the master bedroom. He probably walked down into the dark, damp basement, took one look at the sheer, massive weight of this commercial foundation safe, and completely gave up. Trent likely convinced himself that the catastrophic fire would melt the steel, or that the sheer volume of the collapsed roof would bury the vault forever. He vastly underestimated the incredible structural physics of a burning building and the insulating properties of a flooded cellar. Trent's incredible laziness had created a massive fatal flaw in his father, flawless criminal masterpiece. I ran my gloved hand over the freezing cold combination dial. The sheer legal irony of the situation was absolutely beautiful. Richard had forced the property deed strictly into my name simply to avoid paying a minor six-figure environmental cleanup fee. He wanted to officially saddle me with a toxic wasteland and completely ruin my financial future. But by legally transferring the deed free and clear without any encumbrances, Richard had unknowingly surrendered absolute legal ownership of everything permanently attached to the physical land. I legally owned the toxic ash. I legally owned the ruined foundation, and I legally owned this massive, impenetrable steel vault and every single secret hidden inside of it. I was no longer just a broken, discarded victim freezing in a cheap nylon tent. I was a highly trained forensic auditor staring directly at the physical manifestation of my enemy hidden ledger. Richard had successfully stolen my life, my savings, and my reputation. He thought he had completely buried me in the cold dirt. He never once considered that I would willingly dig through the dirt to find the one catastrophic mistake his arrogant son had left behind. I stared at the complex locking mechanism, listening to the harsh winter wind howling across the empty lot. I did not have the combination to the vault, but I suddenly had all the time and all the absolute motivation in the world to break it wide open. I needed industrial tools to breach a commercial-grade foundation vault. A standard sledgehammer was completely useless against reinforced titanium steel. I limped back down the freezing highway toward the same dilapidated hardware store where I had purchased my initial supplies. I unclasped the only item of value I had left in this entire world, my solid gold wedding band. I dropped the heavy ring onto the scuffed glass counter and looked the weary store owner directly in the eyes. I told him I did not want to sell the jewelry. I wanted to rent his portable gas generator, a heavy-duty angle grinder, and a professional oxyacetylene blowtorch for 72 hours. He looked down at the shiny wedding band, then looked closely at my heavily scarred face. He silently slid the heavy equipment across the counter. Dragging that massive machinery back to the toxic ash pile took every single ounce of strength remaining in my damaged body. Setting up the heavy generator in the freezing mud of the collapsed cellar was an absolute nightmare of physical endurance. My skin grafts were stretched dangerously tight across my healing forearms, and the bitter winter wind sliced right through my thin gray hospital sweatsuit. The actual process of cracking Richard Sterling Personal Vault took 3 agonizingly long days. I started at dawn and worked tirelessly until the portable work lights completely ran out of battery late in the evening. I held the heavy vibrating angle grinder aggressively against the thick steel hinges, sending massive showers of bright orange sparks flying into the dark subterranean pit. The intense mechanical vibration rattled up my tired arms, aggravating my severe burns until tears of pure physical agony blurred my vision. Every single time I squeezed the heavy trigger on the blowtorch, the intense, blinding heat of the blue flame instantly brought back the suffocating terror of the burning master suite. My mind aggressively flashed back to the collapsing oak beam and Caroline turning her back on me in the rainy church parking lot. I actively used those horrific memories as raw fuel. I fed my absolute physical exhaustion with their profound cruelty. I cut slowly through the primary steel housing 1 single millimeter at a time, entirely driven by a cold mechanical rage. By the late afternoon of the 3rd day, my hands were bleeding freely inside my tough leather work gloves. I was starving, dehydrated, and borderline delirious from the freezing temperatures. But I finally managed to sever the internal titanium locking rods. I dropped the heavy blowtorch into the mud and grabbed a thick iron pry bar. I wedged it deep into the scorched, glowing gap between the heavy steel door and the reinforced frame. I threw my entire body weight backward against the cold iron bar. With a loud, agonizing screech of warped metal, the massive vault door finally swung open. I collapsed backward into the freezing sludge, gasping for breath, while the acrid smell of burnt steel filled my raw lungs. I waited a few moments for my racing heart rate to stabilize before crawling forward on my bruised knees to firmly inspect my hard-earned prize. I fully expected to find thick stacks of crisp $100 bills or emergency brick reserves of solid gold. That is exactly what a typical wealthy criminal hoards for a rainy day. But as I pulled my plastic flashlight from my pocket and aimed the bright beam directly into the dark, cavernous interior of the safe, I realized Richard did not deal in physical cash. He dealt in absolute systemic control. There was zero money inside the vault. Instead, the heavy steel shelves were meticulously stacked with exactly what a forensic accountant values far above any standard currency. I reached inside with trembling fingers and pulled out a tall stack of thick, genuine leather-bound ledgers. These were not the sanitized official corporate books Richard proudly presented to his board of directors or the local tax authorities. These were his authentic physical shadow ledgers. I flipped eagerly through the heavy pages, illuminating the neat handwritten columns with my flashlight. My specialized auditing brain instantly recognized the complex, devastating patterns of a massive financial network built entirely on aggressive deception. The hidden books contained detailed, comprehensive records of illicit offshore wire transfers, massive illegal campaign contributions to local politicians, and several dummy corporations explicitly designed to completely hide staggering corporate real estate losses. Sitting right next to the damning shadow ledgers was a sleek velvet box. I opened the tight lid to find a series of heavily encrypted physical hardware tokens. They were digital authentication keys used exclusively for accessing highly secure private bank accounts in the Cayman Islands and Switzerland. Richard was actively bleeding his own domestic real estate empire completely dry and secretly funneling millions of dollars into untouchable foreign tax havens. He had engineered the terrible house fire simply to generate a final massive burst of clean domestic capital while entirely destroying the physical paper trail of his impending corporate insolvency. But the absolute most dangerous item inside that entire vault rested quietly on the very bottom steel shelf. It was a thick manila envelope firmly sealed with a red wax stamp from the State Zoning Commission. I carefully broke the aged wax and slid the pristine, unblemished documents out into the cold winter air. They were the original, completely untampered geographic surveys and commercial zoning deeds for the exact property I was currently sitting on. I rapidly scanned the dense legal jargon, reading the specific land demarcations over and over again, until the absolute brilliance of the situation fully clicked into place. The official documents detailed a highly confidential state highway expansion project. The state government had officially designated this exact parcel of residential land as the mandatory commercial anchor point for a massive new interstate cloverleaf. Richard had deliberately buried this critical infrastructure information. He knew the land was about to completely skyrocket in value. He secretly planned to collect his $5 million fire insurance payout walk completely away from the toxic environmental cleanup and then quietly reclaim the ruined property from me through an aggressive foreclosure the exact second I defaulted on the massive upcoming property taxes. He intended to hold the state transportation department completely hostage and successfully force a massive 9-figure eminent domain buyout. But Richard and his elite legal team had made a fatal arrogant error in the highly rushed divorce proceedings. They were so incredibly eager to legally detach Richard from the impending biohazard fines and perfectly frame me for the violent arson that they had formally transferred the property deed to me completely free and clear. I was the sole undisputed legal owner of the land. I sat alone in the freezing mud surrounded by the toxic ashes of my former life, holding the absolute master key to my enemy's entire existence. Richard thought he had completely destroyed a worthless, disposable son-in-law. He did not realize he had just handed an elite corporate auditor a perfectly preserved map to a $200 million secret. I carefully packed the heavy ledgers, the digital tokens, and the zoning deeds into a waterproof plastic bag. The crushing despair of the past few weeks vanished entirely, replaced by a terrifying, brilliant focus. The time for merely surviving was completely over. It was time to go aggressively on the offensive. The morning after I finally cracked the massive steel vault, I carefully packed the leather ledgers and the offshore tokens into my waterproof plastic bag. I systematically buried the physical safe back under a thick, heavy layer of frozen mud and toxic ash, just in case Trent decided to return for another pathetic gloating session. I wrapped my cheap winter coat tightly around my battered shoulders and began the long 3-mile walk directly into town. My ultimate destination was not a police station or a lawyer office. I headed straight for the local public community library. The elderly librarian sitting at the front circulation desk gave me a highly suspicious and fearful look. My gray sweatsuit was permanently stained with dark soot, and my hands were heavily wrapped in dirty frayed medical gauze. I looked exactly like a broken, homeless vagrant wandering in from the freezing suburban streets to simply seek shelter. She had absolutely no idea she was handing a standard free computer pass to a senior corporate auditor who was about to completely dismantle a billionaire real estate empire. I found a quiet, secluded computer terminal in the far back corner of the dusty reference section. I sat down on the uncomfortable wooden chair, actively ignoring the sharp physical pain shooting straight up my damaged spine. For the past several brutal weeks, my entire existence had been aggressively reduced to raw physical survival. I had battled freezing midnight temperatures, toxic environmental debris, and constant starvation. But as I opened the first heavy leather-bound ledger on the cramped library desk, the battlefield fundamentally shifted. The physical torment instantly faded into the background. I was officially entering an intellectual war zone, and this was the exact terrain where I held absolute total supremacy. I booted up the remarkably slow, outdated library computer and plugged in the first encrypted hardware token I had successfully extracted from Richard's private vault. A complex security prompt immediately filled the glowing desktop monitor, demanding a rigorous sequence of numeric passcodes. Richard was a ruthless and brilliant manipulator, but he was also a creature of deep psychological habit and profound arrogance. I had spent 5 long years personally auditing the charitable foundations he heavily ran through our local community church. I knew his preferred numeric patterns, his mother, maiden name, his childhood street address, and the specific founding dates of his earliest corporate entities. It took me less than 40 minutes of aggressive mathematical trial and error to successfully bypass the secondary firewall protocols. The computer screen suddenly loaded a sprawling international banking interface. My eyes rapidly scanned the staggering account balances resting quietly in hidden offshore Cayman Island trusts. I opened the physical ledger and began meticulously cross-referencing the handwritten numeric entries against the digital wire transfers flashing on the screen. Forensic accounting is essentially the rigorous, exact science of following completely invisible footprints. You do not just look at the money that is present. You look for the massive gaping holes where capital magically disappears and suddenly reappears under highly suspicious corporate umbrellas. As I carefully tracked Richard's financial movements over the past 10 years, a terrifyingly clear and cohesive picture began to form right in front of my eyes. Richard Sterling was not a visionary real estate developer. He was a highly sophisticated con artist operating on a completely staggering scale. I traced tens of millions of dollars systematically drained from his primary domestic development funds. He was aggressively soliciting new capital from the wealthiest, most powerful families in our affluent suburb, including the prominent church elders who had publicly condemned me and ordered me to leave their sanctuary. He promised them guaranteed double-digit returns on massive commercial real estate projects that simply never existed in reality. He was running a textbook Ponzi scheme on a completely massive and devastating scale. He was actively using the fresh incoming capital from brand new investors to pay the fabricated monthly dividends of his older clients, while heavily skimming millions off the very top to exclusively fund his own lavish luxury lifestyle. He bought Caroline her expensive cars, he paid for Trent reckless habits, and he funded his elite country club memberships using stolen local money. But the complex web of lies was rapidly unraveling at the seams. The recent national spike in interest rates had entirely dried up his flow of new incoming investor capital. He could no longer mathematically sustain the massive fake dividend payouts. His elite, powerful investors were starting to ask highly uncomfortable, aggressive questions about their missing money. The hidden offshore accounts were simply his personal private escape fund, explicitly designed to sustain his wealthy family when the entire domestic house of cards finally collapsed. The horrifying realization hit my exhausted mind with the staggering force of a physical blow. The devastating inferno that nearly ended my life was never truly about securing a measly $5 million insurance claim. That specific monetary payout was merely a convenient financial bonus to fund his escape. The primary absolute objective of the fire was the total absolute incineration of the paper trail. The master suite where Caroline peacefully slept was located directly above Richard's primary home office. That specific office housed the private servers, the locked filing cabinets, and the physical documents, tying him directly to a massive multi-million-dollar federal fraud. He instructed Trent to burn the generational estate to the absolute ground explicitly to destroy the irrefutable evidence of his towering corporate theft before the authorities could ever launch an investigation. He completely intended to blame the catastrophic permanent loss of his financial records on the tragic, chaotic residential fire. And to make the narrative perfectly airtight and entirely believable, he needed a desperate, unhinged scapegoat to quickly take the fall for the arson. He happily sacrificed my physical body to the brutal flames and my freedom to the corrupt local prosecutor simply to permanently erase his own staggering crimes from existence. I sat completely still in the quiet public library, staring intensely at the glowing monitor as a profound, chilling clarity washed over my entire soul. Richard thought he had successfully burned the only man who could ever untangle his financial web. He had absolutely no idea he had just given me the precise mathematical ammunition required to obliterate his entire corrupt legacy. The sheer volume of Richard's criminal enterprise was absolutely staggering, but my professional attention immediately shifted away from the offshore banking ledgers. I reached for the heavy manila envelope resting quietly at the bottom of the waterproof bag. I broke the aged red wax seal of the State Zoning Commission and pulled out a thick stack of surveyor maps and municipal planning documents. The architectural blueprints were densely packed with complex engineering jargon and official state government watermarks. I spread them out across the scratched wooden table of the public library, smoothing down the folded creases with my bandaged hands. My eyes meticulously traced the complex web of red and blue ink stretching across the familiar topography of our affluent suburban county. I recognized the exact global coordinates instantly. The detailed surveyor maps were centered directly on the historic family estate. It was the exact same property that currently sat as a toxic frozen pile of ash where I pitched my pathetic nylon camping tent every single night. But the official blueprints did not show a restored residential mansion or a cleared nature reserve. They depicted a sprawling multi-lane commercial highway expansion. I leaned closer to the glowing computer monitor, aggressively cross-referencing the printed zoning application numbers with the public state transportation database. The digital documents outlined a newly approved $200 million interstate cloverleaf project explicitly designed to completely bypass the current downtown gridlock. The central anchor point for this massive infrastructure development was drawn dead center over my ruined, flooded basement. I opened a separate digital file containing Richard private confidential correspondence with powerful local state representatives and influential municipal city planners. Richard had not merely discovered this lucrative highway project by sheer coincidence. He had aggressively and secretly lobbied for this exact geographic route behind closed doors for over 3 solid years. He had deliberately funneled massive amounts of dark corporate money into the political campaign funds of specific key politicians to ensure the new interstate ran straight through his own residential property line. In modern American real estate development, when the state government builds a major commercial highway through private residential land, they are forced to invoke the supreme law of eminent domain. The government is legally required to completely purchase the property from the civilian owner at heavily inflated premium commercial rates. The internal state financial appraisals attached to Richard's secret lobbying files valued our specific parcel of raw land at a staggering $50 million. The sheer, unadulterated scale of his corporate greed was absolutely breathtaking. Richard did not just want the $5 million insurance payout from the residential fire to temporarily plug the massive immediate bleeding in his failing Ponzi scheme. He had expertly engineered a flawless, multi-step financial assassination. His ultimate master plan was to quietly collect the quick insurance cash frame me for the violent arson to completely satisfy the criminal investigators and explicitly burden me with the massive, toxic environmental cleanup. He knew my overworked public defender was highly incompetent. He knew I possessed absolutely zero financial resources to pay the upcoming annual property taxes or the crushing daily municipal blight fines. Richard fully expected me to rapidly default on the land within 6 short months. Once the local county seized the ruined property for delinquent unpaid taxes, Richard intended to quietly swoop in through a hidden anonymous shell company. He planned to buy the land back for absolute pennies on the public auction block and patiently wait for the state government to eventually hand him the $50 million eminent domain buyout. It was a perfectly ruthless strategy designed by a masterful corporate sociopath. It was completely airtight. But Richard and his elite legal team had made one monumental, irreversible mistake during the frantic, aggressive rush of the divorce litigation. They were so unbelievably desperate to expedite the criminal framing process and formally detach the Sterling family from the impending biohazard penalties that they executed a totally clean property transfer. To make the pathetic scapegoat narrative stick perfectly in front of the local judge, Richard's expensive corporate lawyers had hastily drafted a quitclaim deed that transferred the entire estate to me completely free and clear. There were absolutely no hidden financial liens attached to the document. There were no secondary corporate encumbrances. There were no clever legal clawback clauses written into the tiny fine print. I owned the toxic gray ash, the ruined concrete foundation, and the physical dirt with absolute undeniable legal sovereignty. Because they viewed me as a completely disposable, intellectually inferior peasant, they had carelessly handed me the total uncompromised rights to a $50 million government payout. I sat completely frozen in that quiet suburban public library, staring intently at the glowing computer screen as a deep, powerful warmth spread through my freezing, battered body. The heavy, crushing despair of the past month vanished entirely. The hunted wounded prey had just been handed the master keys to the entire hunting ground. For the first time since I woke up choking on that thick black smoke, I finally smiled. It was not a smile of joy or relief. It was the sharp, cold smile of an auditor who had just found the fatal mathematical error in his enemy balance sheet. Richard Sterling had built an empire on manipulation and fire. He had burned my life to the ground to protect his own wealth. But in his supreme, blinding arrogance, he failed to respect the fundamental rule of accounting. Every single transaction leaves a permanent trace. I gathered the heavy leather ledgers, the encrypted offshore banking tokens, and the priceless state zoning deeds. I carefully zipped them inside my waterproof plastic bag, protecting them like absolute sacred relics. I stood up from the wooden library chair. My burned legs still ached with every movement, but my posture was entirely different. I was no longer a broken homeless victim seeking shelter from the winter rain. I was a completely lethal financial weapon, walking back out into the cold daylight, fully prepared to execute a flawless multi-million-dollar destruction. I walked out of the public library, moving through the frozen suburban streets like a ghost, completely invisible to the wealthy community that had just discarded me. Richard had vast financial resources and deep connections within the local telecommunications grid. If I used any standard accounts or logged into a recognizable network, his corporate security team would trigger an immediate alert. I needed absolute digital anonymity to execute my strategy. I limped toward a dingy convenience store on the extreme edge of the county line. Using the last remaining cash from pawning my gold wedding ring, I purchased a cheap prepaid burner smartphone and a heavily encrypted data card. I activated the untraceable device sitting on a damp concrete bench in the cold alleyway behind the shop. I was no longer playing the role of the defeated victim. I was building a fortified offensive position completely under their radar. Bureaucracy is intentionally designed to exhaust and intimidate the average citizen, but I had spent my entire adult life dissecting highly complex corporate structures. I dialed the central headquarters of the State Department of Transportation, bypassing the standard public reception lines by utilizing the direct internal directory codes I had memorized during my time as a senior auditor. I aggressively navigated the phone tree until I reached the specific elite division handling commercial infrastructure acquisitions. I calmly requested an immediate secure conference with the lead director of the new Interstate Cloverleaf expansion project. The senior administrative assistant immediately tried to brush me off loudly, claiming the director was entirely unavailable to the general public. I did not raise my voice or show a single ounce of frustration. I simply stated my name and informed her that I held the absolute unencumbered deed to the primary anchor parcel required for their upcoming $200 million highway project. I warned her that if I did not speak to the regional director within 60 seconds, I was fully prepared to file a massive legal injunction that would completely halt their state-funded construction for a solid decade. The line went dead silent for a moment, before being rapidly transferred to the highest executive level. The state director answered the phone with a highly irritated and impatient tone. He was completely expecting to hear the smooth, polished voice of Richard Sterling. Richard had spent 3 years aggressively whining and dining these exact state officials, carefully laying the political groundwork for his massive eminent domain payday. The director was utterly shocked and audibly confused when I introduced myself as Nate Gibson, the sole legal proprietor of the devastated historic property. He initially accused me of being a desperate fraud attempting to stall a vital state project. I did not waste time arguing. I seamlessly tethered my burner phone to a secure mobile hotspot and emailed him pristine scanned copies of the stamped quitclaim deed, the local environmental blight citations, and my official state-issued identification. I listened to the absolute dead silence on the other end of the line as his elite legal team desperately verified the authenticity of the documents in real time. They rapidly checked the county property registry and realized the staggering truth. Richard had completely relinquished his golden goose in a frantic, greedy rush to dodge the toxic cleanup liabilities and permanently frame me for the arson. The state government had absolutely no legal obligation to deal with Richard or his massive real estate empire anymore. They had to negotiate exclusively with the battered homeless man sitting in a frozen alleyway. The state director frantically attempted to regain control of the conversation, offering patronizing sympathies for my horrific fire injuries and suggesting a low-ball initial offer to take the toxic property off my hands. I did not give him a single moment to breathe or coordinate with outside counsel. I leveraged my elite auditing background, speaking their exact bureaucratic and financial language with lethal precision. I firmly informed the director that I had already thoroughly reviewed the internal confidential appraisals, valuing the commercial rezoning of that specific dirt at exactly $50 million. I could hear the color completely drain from his face over the cellular connection. He realized instantly that I possessed the highly classified zoning blueprints and the secret surveyor maps. I completely shocked the silent room of government officials by stating I was entirely willing to sign a preliminary binding acquisition contract right then and there, smoothly bypassing years of brutal public eminent domain litigation. But my total cooperation came with a strict, non-negotiable premium price tag. I demanded a guaranteed state buyout of exactly $55 million. I demanded the contract be locked behind an ironclad non-disclosure agreement, keeping the entire transaction totally hidden from the local county courts and Richard political allies. And I demanded the legally binding preliminary documents be digitally executed before the end of the business day. The state attorneys scrambled aggressively in the background. They mathematically knew that avoiding a highly publicized 10-year legal blockade and securing the mandatory anchor land was easily worth the extra $5 million. I sat on the freezing concrete bench, my ruined legs throbbing with intense, agonizing pain as I waited for the government machinery to turn. By 4 o'clock that exact same afternoon, a secure digital courier notification illuminated the cracked screen of my cheap burner phone. It was the official preliminary acquisition contract drafted flawlessly by the highest legal authorities in the state. I carefully reviewed every single clause, ensuring there were absolutely no hidden loopholes or secondary municipal encumbrances. I used my unbandaged right hand to digitally sign the binding agreement, locking the state into the massive purchase. In complete, utter silence, without bragging or causing a single public spectacle, I had successfully secured an absolute fortune. I had transformed a toxic pile of charred ashes into $55 million of undeniable leverage, completely outsmarting the elite billionaires who had confidently left me to burn. I relocated to an all-night commercial print shop on the decaying industrial side of town. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed with a harsh, sterile energy, but my mind was completely locked into a state of absolute flow. The state highway buyout was officially secured and safely digitally locked away. That massive victory, however, merely secured my personal future. It did not balance the terrible scales of justice. Richard and Trent had intentionally left me to burn alive under a collapsing oak beam. They had stripped my financial dignity bare and publicly paraded me as an unhinged, violent addict in front of my own church congregation. To achieve true systemic karma, I needed to completely dismantle their towering illusion of high society superiority. I needed to build a flawless, inescapable legal guillotine. I rented a secure private cubicle equipped with a high-speed commercial scanner and a pristine laser printer. I carefully laid out the contents of the thick, leather-bound ledgers across the wide desk. Forensic accounting is not simply about adding numbers together. It is about constructing an undeniable narrative from highly fragmented pieces of hidden data. Richard was a brilliant sociopathic manipulator, but he suffered from the fatal flaw of incredible generational arrogance. He genuinely believed that his wealth made him completely untouchable, so he documented his own towering crimes with the meticulous pride of a seasoned corporate collector. The physical ledgers detailed the exact flow of the multi-million-dollar Ponzi scheme. I cross-referenced every single fraudulent domestic real estate project with the hidden offshore banking tokens. I created a master spreadsheet demonstrating exactly how he siphoned newly invested capital to pay off older, angry clients while completely funding his own extravagant lifestyle. But the absolute golden bullet rested quietly in the very back pocket of the third leather binder. It was a printed email exchange between Richard and his lazy, reckless son. Trent was a man who lacked the basic intelligence to conduct criminal activity with any real discretion. In a deeply arrogant email sent just 48 hours before the devastating house fire, Trent brazenly detailed his exact preparation methods. The printed text was practically a signed criminal confession. Trent complained bitterly about the heavy physical labor required to clear the basement. He explicitly whined to his father that the antique foundation safe was entirely too heavy to move. He wrote that he had successfully spread the industrial accelerant directly around my ground floor office just like Richard had instructed. He actually bragged about perfectly staging the fake credit card applications on my personal desk before soaking the entire room in volatile chemicals. I held that specific piece of paper in my heavily bandaged hands, reading the cruel, callous words over and over again. Trent had literally documented their premeditated attempted murder simply because he wanted a pat on the back from his domineering father. I ran the damning email through the high-speed scanner, saving the high-resolution digital file directly onto a secure encrypted flash drive. I spent the next 8 consecutive hours transforming the chaotic raw data into a masterfully polished executive summary. I built a comprehensive airtight dossier. I created simple, undeniable flowcharts connecting Richard local shell companies directly to the secret Cayman Island trusts. I mapped out the exact timeline of the insurance fraud, proving mathematically that the $5 million residential claim was a desperate calculated maneuver to inject emergency liquidity into his failing criminal empire. I highlighted the forged credit line applications and provided the authentic tracking data, proving my absolute innocence. I made the entire package completely foolproof. Any first-year law student could read my summary and secure a slam-dunk federal conviction. But I knew the regional justice system was deeply corrupted by Richard Wealth. If I blindly handed the entire completed dossier over to the local district attorney, he would likely bury the evidence and immediately tip off my father-in-law. I needed to bypass the local compromised authorities entirely. I needed to drop the bloody meat directly into a tank filled with far more dangerous predators. Using the untraceable prepaid burner phone and a highly masked internet protocol address, I carefully targeted 2 specific individuals. First, I located the contact information for the lead investigator at the Regional Federal Bureau of Investigation White-Collar Crime Division. Federal agents care absolutely nothing about local suburban politics or country club networking. They care strictly about securing massive high-profile convictions. Second, I found the direct private email address for the senior claims adjuster at Zenith National Insurance. Insurance companies despise paying out massive multi-million-dollar settlements, even more than they despise corporate arson. I did not send them the entire completed dossier. I knew how to expertly bait a hook. I needed them hungry, highly curious, and fiercely motivated to dig deeper. I drafted a concise anonymous email teaser. For the federal agent, I attached a single page from the Shadow Ledger detailing 3 specific illegal wire transfers moving massive sums of stolen local capital into the hidden offshore accounts. I provided the exact banking routing numbers and the dates of execution. For the senior insurance investigator, I attached the high-resolution scan of Trent's incredibly stupid email specifically highlighting his blatant confession regarding the industrial chemical accelerant and the staged home office. I added a single brief paragraph to the bottom of both anonymous messages. I informed them that Richard Sterling was actively finalizing a $5 million fraudulent claim to cover the tracks of a decade-long Ponzi scheme. I promised that a massive comprehensive physical dossier containing the absolute total proof of his towering criminal enterprise would be delivered directly to their respective desks in exactly 72 hours. I hit the send button on the encrypted keyboard and watched the digital progress bar flash across the bright monitor. The messages vanished into the dark ether, instantly setting massive federal and corporate tripwires. I leaned back into the stiff wooden chair, letting a deep, heavy sigh escape my raw lungs. I powered down the rented terminal and packed the original physical documents safely back into my waterproof bag. Richard was currently busy polishing his fancy shoes and preparing his fake, tearful speech for his upcoming high society charity gala. He was entirely oblivious to the terrifying fact that the silent, broken man he had carelessly discarded in the freezing mud had just completely severed the main structural support beams of his entire existence. The guillotine was officially built. All I had to do now was patiently wait for the arrogant billionaire to gladly place his own neck right on the chopping block. The massive federal tripwires were officially activated, but a cornered billionaire is a highly unpredictable variable. If Richard Sterling sensed even a microscopic fraction of the devastating moves I had just executed, he would instantly use his remaining liquid capital to charter a private jet to a non-extradition country. I absolutely needed him to stay exactly where he was. I needed him heavily bloated with unearned arrogance and completely blind to the massive federal guillotine currently lowering over his neck. The only guaranteed way to keep a ruthless predator standing comfortably out in the open is to entirely convince him that his chosen prey has already bled to death. I walked out of the bleak industrial print shop and navigated the freezing rain toward a brightly lit 24-hour diner down the street. The diner smelled strongly of stale grease and cheap bleach. I slid into a cracked vinyl booth near the back emergency exit, ordering a single cup of bitter black coffee just to justify occupying the space. I pulled the cheap plastic burner phone from my damp pocket. It was time to execute the most humiliating, degrading performance of my entire adult life. I accessed a secure cloud-based messaging application and digitally spoofed my destroyed cellular number, ensuring the incoming text would clearly display my authentic name on Caroline pristine luxury smartphone. I stared at the blinking cursor for a long time, actively calculating the specific psychological profile of my soon-to-be ex-wife. Caroline fed exclusively on a diet of supreme superiority and unearned privilege. She viewed basic human suffering as a personal moral failing. If I came at her with righteous anger or aggressive legal threats, she would instantly raise her defensive shields and alert her father, corporate security team. I had to offer her an absolute pathetic unconditional surrender. I carefully typed out a long rambling message, deliberately utilizing poor grammar and desperate frantic phrasing to simulate total mental collapse. I told her that the freezing winter temperatures were making my severe third-degree burns highly infected. I told her I had not eaten a solid hot meal in 4 straight days, and that the physical agony was completely breaking my mind. I begged her for a miserable, pathetic sum of exactly $500. I promised her that if she simply wired me the money to purchase a cheap cross-country bus ticket, I would immediately abandon the toxic, ruined property forever and flee to sleep on a distant relative couch 3 states away. I explicitly wrote that she and her father had completely won the war, and I simply wanted the agonizing pain to finally stop. I hit the send button and watched the digital delivery receipt confirm the message had safely penetrated her wealthy, insulated world. I sat completely still in the dreary diner, sipping the scalding black coffee and listening to the heavy rain aggressively beat against the thin glass window panes. 10 minutes slowly dragged by. Then 20 agonizing minutes passed. I knew exactly what was happening inside their massive, heavily guarded rental mansion across town. Caroline was eagerly showing the pathetic text message to Richard and Trent. They were likely sitting around a polished marble kitchen island, laughing uproariously over glasses of expensive imported wine, actively mocking the broken, discarded accountant who was currently begging for table scraps in the mud. Finally, the cheap plastic burner phone violently vibrated against the sticky laminate table. The bright screen illuminated with her incoming reply. It was not a long, heavily considered message. It was a staggering, breathtaking masterclass in pure, unadulterated venom. Caroline did not offer a single word of basic human pity. She explicitly told me that my current physical and financial suffering was entirely my own pathetic fault for trying to play in a league I did not belong in. She called me a weak, fragile coward who lacked the basic masculine backbone to handle a simple corporate real estate dispute. She brutally typed that she would rather light a $500 bill on fire and watch it burn to ash than ever spend another single red cent preserving my miserable, useless existence. She ended the hostile digital barrage by ordering me to enjoy my miserable bus ride to absolute nowhere, and issued a stark formal warning that if I ever attempted to contact the Sterling family again, she would personally ensure the local district attorney locked me in a concrete cell for the rest of my natural life. I did not feel a single microscopic ounce of sorrow as I read her horrific, deeply abusive words. I did not shed a single tear over the total death of my marriage. I felt a deep, profound, thrilling surge of absolute total victory. I meticulously captured high-resolution digital screenshots of the entire text exchange, perfectly preserving the exact timestamps and the underlying digital routing metadata. This was not just a painful, nostalgic memory to dwell on. It was highly admissible, irrefutable legal proof of their staggering collective malice. It permanently documented their total absolute lack of human empathy, and firmly established the undeniable fact that they firmly believed I was completely neutralized and fleeing the jurisdiction. I immediately forwarded the entire interaction to my secure offshore data vault, sealing the psychological trap perfectly shut. The calculated ripple effect of my fake surrender was immediate and absolutely devastating to their situational awareness. Through a quiet, reliable network of local suburban contractors that I still possessed access to, I learned exactly how Richard reacted to the wonderful news of my supposed cowardly departure. He completely exhaled. The minor annoying logistical threat of his stubborn middle-class son-in-law had officially been permanently erased from the board. He immediately accelerated his grand corporate plans with supreme, blinding confidence. With the looming threat of my presence entirely removed from the local equation, Richard proudly signed the final massive catering and venue contracts for his upcoming public celebration. He firmly believed he had outsmarted the law, outsmarted his wealthy investors, and entirely crushed me into the dirt. He was actively and enthusiastically stepping right onto the hidden trap door, exactly as I had mathematically calculated, completely unaware that the rope was already tightly wrapped around his neck. 72 hours after I sent those anonymous digital tripwires into the federal ether, the crisp winter evening finally arrived. The Oakwood Hills Country Club was a towering monument to generational wealth and exclusionary privilege. It sat perfectly perched on a sprawling emerald hillside overlooking our affluent suburb. Tonight, every single crystal chandelier inside the grand ballroom was blazing with an aggressive, blinding light. Richard Sterling was officially hosting the inaugural Sterling Foundation Rebuilding Gala. The sheer unadulterated audacity of the event was absolutely staggering to witness. He had explicitly marketed the extravagant evening as a deeply emotional community healing process. It was supposedly a beautiful night to collectively grieve the tragic loss of a historic local landmark and to bravely look toward a brighter, prosperous future. In reality, it was a massive, highly orchestrated public relations stunt. Richard needed a spectacular theatrical distraction to formally accept his $5 million insurance check and completely legitimize his next criminal maneuver. I parked my rented sedan at the far edge of the meticulously manicured grounds, safely hidden deep within the shadows of the towering pine trees. I sat quietly behind the steering wheel, watching the endless parade of luxury vehicles arriving at the grand valet stand. The entire local elite establishment had eagerly turned out in full force to kiss the proverbial ring of the Sterling family patriarch. I recognized the wealthy county commissioners, the influential local judges, and the prominent real estate developers stepping out of their warm limousines. I even spotted Pastor Miller stepping proudly onto the red carpet wearing a custom-tailored black tuxedo. The very same holy man who had fiercely condemned me and ordered me out of his sanctuary was now cheerfully rubbing elbows with the man who had actively tried to murder me. The blatant hypocrisy made my stomach churn, but I kept my breathing slow and incredibly measured. They were all willingly walking straight into a beautifully decorated slaughterhouse. The local media had thoroughly covered the lavish preparations all week long, so I intimately knew every single detail of Richard Grand design. The $5 million insurance payout was actually just the opening act of his sinister theatrical performance. He had deliberately invited the wealthiest untouched families in the county to this specific gala for one singular ruthless reason. He was officially launching a brand new commercial real estate investment fund tonight. Richard was desperately seeking fresh, untainted capital to silently patch the massive gaping financial holes in his failing offshore accounts. He was going to stand on that brilliantly lit stage, look his closest loyal friends directly in the eyes, and promised them massive guaranteed returns on their investments. He was actively spinning up a brand new Ponzi scheme right over the imaginary ashes of his murdered son-in-law. He truly believed his narrative was completely bulletproof. He believed his path to total financial salvation was officially secured. A long, sleek black limousine pulled smoothly up to the front entrance, and the valet rushed forward to open the heavy door. Richard stepped out first, looking absolutely radiant and completely victorious. He wore a crisp white tuxedo jacket that commanded the immediate attention of the flashing press cameras. Trent followed closely behind him, wearing his usual arrogant smirk, completely unbothered by the fact that he had personally poured toxic accelerant all over my home office. Then Caroline gracefully emerged into the flashing lights. She was wearing a stunning, expensive diamond necklace and a deeply elegant emerald green evening gown that absolutely screamed new money. She linked her arm tightly through her father's arm, performing the role of the brave, traumatized survivor with flawless, terrifying perfection. She smiled softly for the local reporters, completely secure in the false belief that I was currently freezing on a miserable cross-country bus riding far away from her perfect, wealthy reality. Right behind the Sterling family entourage, an older, distinguished gentleman stepped out of a separate town car holding a polished silver briefcase. I instantly recognized his face from my meticulous corporate research. He was the senior executive regional director for Zenith National Insurance. Richard had personally demanded that the insurance company present the massive settlement check in a highly public ceremonial fashion. It was a calculated move to visibly prove to his skeptical new investors that the Sterling family was thoroughly vetted, fully insured, and completely backed by massive institutional capital. Richard wanted the entire town to physically see him holding $5 million of clean, sanitized money. He wanted to cement his untouchable status in front of the local politicians and the greedy socialites. I turned off the engine of my rented car and looked at my own reflection in the rearview mirror. The defeated, homeless vagrant who had begged for his life under a collapsing roof was completely gone. The desperate, weeping man who had signed away his entire life savings in a dreary courthouse conference room no longer existed. Using a tiny fraction of the massive legal advance I had secured from the State Highway Commission, I had properly equipped myself for this exact specific moment. I was wearing a sharply tailored dark charcoal suit that perfectly concealed the thick medical bandages still tightly wrapping my chest and arms. My burns still sent sharp radiating spikes of physical pain down my legs, but my mind was utterly, absolutely cold. I reached over to the passenger seat and picked up the heavy, solid black leather briefcase I had prepared earlier that afternoon. It contained crisp, clean physical copies of the absolute, undeniable truth. It held the offshore wire transfer confirmations, the printed email confession from Trent, and the official state zoning acquisition contract proving I was now worth $55 million. I checked my burner phone one last time. The silent digital confirmation from my anonymous federal contacts had arrived precisely on schedule. The trap was perfectly set, and the steel blade of the guillotine was raised to the absolute maximum height. I opened my car door and stepped out into the crisp winter night air, completely ready to walk into that blinding ballroom and permanently burn the Sterling family legacy to the ground. The Oakwood Hills Country Club Grand Ballroom was an absolute masterpiece of architectural excess and exclusionary social elitism. I stood completely silent in the heavily shadowed vestibule just outside the main entrance, listening closely to the muffled sounds of a live string quartet and the constant clinking of expensive crystal. The massive venue was packed to absolute maximum capacity. Waiters in pristine white jackets glided seamlessly through the wealthy crowd, carrying polished silver trays loaded with imported caviar and top-shelf champagne. Every single person who truly mattered in our affluent suburban county had eagerly paid $10,000 a plate to attend this highly exclusive charity event. They were completely unaware they had actually purchased front-row tickets to the spectacular public execution of the Sterling family legacy. Through a narrow gap in the heavy oak double doors, I watched Richard command the brightly lit main stage. He He was currently delivering an absolute masterclass in theatrical emotional manipulation. His normally robust, booming voice was carefully modulated into a soft, trembling whisper, explicitly designed to project profound paternal vulnerability. He gripped the edges of the polished wooden podium, tightly bowing his graying head, as if the sheer emotional weight of the recent weeks was simply too much for one man to physically bear. Caroline sat perfectly positioned in the front, VIP row, delicately dabbing at her completely dry eyes with a monogrammed silk handkerchief. Trent stood dutifully right behind his father, trying his absolute hardest to mimic a facial expression of solemn dignity instead of his usual spoiled arrogance. "We lost so much more than just a physical house that terrible night," Richard told the captivated silent audience. His voice echoed clearly through the state-of-the-art sound system, commanding total absolute attention. "We lost a massive, irreplaceable piece of our family history. But the violent fire consuming our physical walls was absolutely nothing compared to the deep, profound betrayal we suffered at the hands of someone we graciously welcomed into our own home. My brilliant daughter Caroline miraculously survived a horrific nightmare. She barely survived a deeply disturbed psychopathic man who allowed his own secret financial failures to dangerously twist his mind into committing unspeakable violence against the people who loved him the most." A collective, highly sympathetic gasp immediately rippled through the packed, luxurious ballroom. Wealthy, influential socialites shook their heads in pure orchestrated disgust. I spotted Pastor Miller sitting at a prominent table near the front, wiping a single stray tear from his cheek and nodding in pious total agreement. It was physically sickening to witness the absolute ease with which Richard spun his dark, sinister web. He was expertly using my completely ruined name to build a massive, impenetrable wall of public sympathy. He was actively preying on the basic human compassion of his wealthy peers, softening them up perfectly for the impending aggressive pitch of his brand-new fraudulent investment fund. But we are absolutely not gathered here tonight to endlessly dwell on the pathetic actions of a cowardly, broken man who has already fled this great state. Richard continued, his voice suddenly rising with calculated, triumphant energy. "We are here tonight to talk about absolute community resilience. We are here to officially close the dark, terrible chapter of this fiery tragedy and boldly rebuild a much brighter and far more profitable future for this beautiful town." Right on his exact cue, the bright stage spotlights shifted aggressively, illuminating the senior regional executive from Zenith National Insurance. The distinguished older gentleman walked proudly out from behind the heavy velvet stage curtain. He was carrying a massive, oversized novelty check printed perfectly with bold black corporate lettering. The staggering amount was explicitly made out to the Sterling Foundation for exactly $5 million. The entire ballroom instantly erupted into thunderous, overwhelming standing applause. Local news photographers aggressively rushed the front of the stage, lifting their heavy flashing cameras to permanently capture the glorious, triumphant moment. Richard stepped away from the podium, reaching out his perfectly manicured hands with a wide, brilliant, victorious smile spreading across his face. I did not wait for his greedy fingers to touch the glossy cardboard. I placed both of my hands flat against the heavy brass handles of the ballroom double doors and pushed them open with absolute violent physical force. The thick wooden doors slammed aggressively against the interior lobby walls with a sound like a brilliant crack of summer thunder. The cheerful, lively string quartet abruptly stopped playing mid-note. The enthusiastic, thunderous applause died in an absolute instant, replaced by a sudden, suffocating vacuum of total dead silence. Hundreds of heads snapped around simultaneously to look directly at the back of the massive, opulent room. I stepped out of the dark shadows and walked directly into the bright, ambient light of the glowing crystal chandeliers. I was absolutely no longer the pathetic, shivering vagrant they had all so comfortably discarded and openly mocked. I was no longer wearing dirty, cheap sweatpants or leaning heavily on a bent aluminum medical cane. I had utilized a tiny fraction of my secure state highway advance to properly armor myself for this exact specific battle. I wore a pristine custom-tailored dark charcoal suit that fit my frame with absolute militant precision. My posture was perfectly straight, completely ignoring the dull, lingering ache of the healing skin grafts binding my hidden legs. My face still carried the faint pink-textured scars of the blazing inferno, but my eyes were entirely calm, terrifying, and utterly empty of any mercy. Empty. I began walking slowly and deliberately down the long center aisle of the quiet ballroom. The deep sea of wealthy, influential guests instantly parted before me like a wave of terrified, startled sheep. People physically recoiled, pulling their expensive designer gowns and tailored tuxedo jackets away from my path as if I were a literal walking ghost returning straight from the graveyard. I kept my gaze locked entirely forward. I did not bother looking at the stunned pale faces of the corrupt local politicians or the hypocritical church elders who had cast me out. I kept my eyes fixed dead center on the brightly lit stage. The physical transformation on Richard's face was absolutely incredible to witness in real time. The smug, victorious smile completely melted off his aging features, leaving behind a pale, damp mask of sheer, unadulterated panic. His outstretched hands froze awkwardly in midair, completely missing the massive novelty insurance check. Trent took a sudden, frantic step backward, actually stumbling over a thick black microphone cable in his clumsy, desperate haste. In the front row, Caroline dropped her silk handkerchief directly onto the polished floor. Her jaw went completely slack, her hazel eyes growing incredibly wide with a rapidly dawning absolute terror. She recognized the thick, solid black leather briefcase I was gripping tightly in my right hand. I reached the front edge of the elevated platform without breaking my steady, relentless stride. The insurance executive stood completely frozen, clutching his $5 million prop, looking frantically back and forth between my scarred face and Richard's suddenly trembling hands. The local news photographers slowly lowered their flashing cameras, sensing instantly that the carefully scripted public relations narrative had just violently derailed. I stood right at the bottom of the short wooden staircase, looking up at the billionaire titan who had confidently ordered my execution. The trap was perfectly sprung. Richard Sterling stared down at me from his elevated platform with a look of pure, unadulterated horror, completely wiping away his meticulously crafted public relations smile. For a fraction of a second, his arrogant brain could simply not process how a broken, bankrupt man was standing upright in his exclusive country club. He quickly recovered his predatory instincts and frantically gestured toward the perimeter of the grand ballroom. He leaned sharply into the polished wooden podium and aggressively ordered his private security team to immediately remove the hostile trespasser from the premises. Two massive men in dark suits stepped forward from the shadows, reaching into their jackets as they moved rapidly down the center aisle. Before those security guards could take another single step, the heavy brass doors at the rear of the hall swung wide open for a second time. A perfectly synchronized team of 12 men and women marched purposefully into the blinding light of the crystal chandeliers. They were wearing dark navy windbreakers with the bright yellow letters of the Federal Bureau of Investigation printed boldly across their backs. Leading the tactical formation was Special Agent Harris, the senior white-collar crime investigator I had successfully baited with my anonymous digital dossier. Marching right beside him in a crisp gray suit was the State Highway Commissioner. The country club security guards instantly froze, raising their empty hands and completely backing away from the undeniable absolute authority of the federal government. Agent Harris walked straight up the short wooden stairs to the center of the brightly lit stage. He did not say a single word to Richard. He simply reached out and firmly plucked the microphone away from the billionaire trembling fingers. Harris turned around and handed the heavy metal microphone directly down to me. I gripped the cool steel in my right hand and slowly walked up the steps to face the massive, silent crowd. I looked out over the sprawling sea of incredibly wealthy investors, the local politicians who had enabled this corruption, and the hypocritical church elders who had so eagerly cast me out into the freezing rain. I did not raise my voice in anger. I did not shout or scream like an unhinged victim seeking shallow revenge. I spoke with the perfectly measured, icy calm of a senior forensic accountant, delivering a final, absolute corporate audit. "Good evening, ladies and gentlemen," I said, my voice echoing cleanly through the massive state-of-the-art sound system. "Richard Sterling just told you a highly emotional, deeply moving story about family resilience and tragic, unavoidable loss. He told you that a devastating electrical fire completely destroyed his historic residential estate. He told you that my own severe financial desperation was entirely to blame for the nightmare. But human beings can easily fabricate stories. Numbers and physical evidence completely lack the basic capacity to lie. And tonight I am here to deliver the true, unfiltered audit of the Sterling family legacy." A suffocating absolute silence held the entire ballroom completely captive. I placed my solid black leather briefcase onto the podium right next to the oversized $5 million novelty insurance check. I opened the brass latches and pulled out a single sheet of printed paper, holding it up under the bright stage lights for the entire wealthy congregation to see. "This is a direct internal communication sent by Trent Sterling exactly 48 hours before I woke up. Choking on black smoke, I stated clearly, projecting my voice to the very back of the room. In this specific email, Trent violently complains to his father about the heavy physical labor required to pour industrial-grade chemical accelerant around my personal home office. He actively brags about perfectly planting forged credit card applications on my desk to guarantee the local fire marshal would falsely frame me for the massive blaze. They did not simply want to secure a fast $5 million insurance payout. They intentionally pinned my legs under a burning antique oak beam and happily left me to die in a toxic inferno, so I could never stand on this stage and tell you the absolute truth. A collective horrifying gasp ripped violently through the high society crowd. Women covered their mouths in pure shock, while powerful local businessmen stared at Richard with profound, dawning disgust. Trent made a sudden, desperate sprint toward the side emergency exit, but two heavily armed federal agents seamlessly blocked the heavy doors, forcing him to slowly back away in total pathetic defeat. But why would a supposed billionaire real estate titan need a minor $5 million insurance check so desperately that he would actively murder his own son-in-law? I asked, letting the question hang heavily in the tense ambient air. I reached into my briefcase again and pulled out the thick, heavy leather-bound shadow ledgers. Because Richard Sterling is not a visionary commercial developer. He is a highly sophisticated corporate parasite. I slammed the heavy books down onto the wooden podium. The dull, heavy thud sounded like a judge slamming a gavel. I hold in my hands the authentic, unfiltered financial records of the Sterling Foundation. I continued, my voice slicing through the rising panic in the ballroom. For the past 10 consecutive years, Richard has been actively operating a staggering multi-million-dollar Ponzi scheme. He has not successfully broken ground on a single new commercial property since 2015. The massive double-digit investment returns he proudly promised you all tonight simply do not exist in reality. Your previous capital investments have already been systematically funneled into private, encrypted offshore bank accounts in the Cayman Islands. He specifically used your hard-earned money to fund Caroline luxury designer lifestyle and to entirely cover Trent massive personal gambling debts. Your money is completely permanently gone. Absolute total pandemonium instantly shattered the elegant atmosphere of the gala. Wealthy investors began shouting furiously at the stage, demanding answers about their missing retirement funds. Pastor Miller dropped his face into his trembling hands, looking physically sick as he finally realized he had aligned his church with a towering, absolute monster. I ignored the chaotic, roaring crowd and slowly turned my entire body to look directly at Richard. The mighty, invincible patriarch of the Sterling family was gasping for shallow breaths, his face completely drained of all color, looking like a fragile, terrified old man who had just watched his entire universe evaporate. "You thought you had executed the absolute perfect corporate assassination," I whispered directly into the microphone, stepping uncomfortably close to his trembling frame. "You truly believed you could legally saddle me with the toxic property deed to avoid the massive environmental cleanup fines, and then quickly foreclose on the land to claim the $50 million state highway expansion buyout. You secretly lobbied local politicians for 3 years to run a new commercial interstate directly through our flooded basement. I pointed a firm bandaged finger toward the state highway commissioner standing quietly at the bottom of the stage steps. But the state commissioner is physically standing here tonight to officially confirm that the preliminary eminent domain acquisition contract has already been legally signed. By aggressively rushing to officially frame me and discard me, your elite corporate lawyers completely surrendered the pristine property deed to my name, free and clear of any secondary encumbrances. I now personally hold the absolute total legal rights to a $55 million government payout. You burned your own majestic empire completely to the ground, and you willfully handed me the single remaining asset that actually held any true staggering value. Richard's knees finally buckled under the immense crushing weight of my mathematical destruction. He collapsed heavily onto the polished stage floor, staring blankly at the dark leather ledgers that had just permanently ended his life. The illusion of his absolute superiority was completely dead. The forensic audit was officially over, and the final balance was undeniably mathematically perfect. The grand ballroom descended into absolute chaotic bedlam the very second my final words resonated through the massive speakers. The distinguished senior executive from Zenith National Insurance did not wait for Richard Sterling to pick his trembling body up off the polished hardwood floor. The insurance man aggressively snatched the massive $5 million novelty check right out of the frozen air where the executive assistant was awkwardly holding it. He turned on his polished heel and marched swiftly out the side exit, looking thoroughly nauseated by his brief public association with the Sterling family. Special Agent Harris wasted absolutely no time letting the dramatic tension settle. He stepped smoothly over the dropped microphone and hauled my former father-in-law up by the expensive lapels of his custom white tuxedo jacket. The sharp metallic click of heavy steel handcuffs echoing clearly through the silenced room was undeniably the most beautiful symphony I had ever heard in my entire life. Richard did not fight back. The towering, invincible real estate mogul who had confidently ordered my execution in a sterile hospital room was now completely devoid of his signature arrogance. His knees buckled repeatedly, forcing the 2 federal agents to physically support his dead weight as they marched him toward the main lobby. He stared blankly at the floor, completely broken by the absolute mathematical certainty of his own destruction. On the opposite side of the stage, Trent was being violently pinned against the floral wallpaper near the emergency exit by 2 large, heavily armed federal investigators. My former brother-in-law was sobbing openly, his arrogant, tough guy persona instantly vaporizing the second the cold steel locked tightly around his wrists. He began desperately shouting across the room that the arson was entirely his father's idea, and that he only poured the volatile chemicals because Richard explicitly threatened to cut off his lucrative trust fund. Every single frantic word out of his mouth only drove another heavy iron nail deeper into their collective legal coffin. The wealthy elite of our suburban county, the exact same influential people who had eagerly paid $10,000 a plate to rub elbows with a supposed visionary, were now scrambling frantically toward the coat check. They looked at the Sterling men with pure, unadulterated revulsion, desperate to immediately distance their own corporate portfolios from a massive federal fraud investigation. Pastor Miller had already completely vanished into the night, abandoning his most generous donors, the exact second the political wind shifted against them. They were all fleeing the sinking ship with breathtaking speed. Through the swirling, panicked crowd of fleeing socialites and stern-faced federal investigators, Caroline stood completely frozen near the front row of VIP tables. Her stunning emerald evening gown suddenly looked ridiculously absurd against the stark, brutal reality of her impending poverty. I stood near the edge of the stage and watched the frantic, desperate calculations furiously processing behind her hazel eyes. Her father was going to a federal penitentiary. Her brother was a publicly confessed arsonist. The domestic bank accounts were going to be instantly frozen and seized by the government to properly restitute the defrauded country club investors. She was now legally tethered to a bankrupt criminal enterprise with absolutely zero hidden assets to her name. and she had personally aggressively finalized a ruthless divorce that completely severed her from the one man who currently held a guaranteed $55 million acquisition contract with the state government. The realization hit her with the brutal physical force of a swinging sledgehammer. She practically tripped over her expensive designer heels, rushing across the chaotic ballroom floor toward me. The flawlessly applied makeup was streaming down her cheeks in dark, thick rivers of mascara, completely ruining her perfectly curated high society image. She threw herself at my chest, attempting to wrap her arms tightly around my neck in a highly dramatic display of profound, desperate sorrow. I took a firm, deliberate step backward, letting her stumble awkwardly into the empty space between us. "Nate, please," she sobbed, her voice cracking with highly manufactured hysteria. "You have to believe me. I had absolutely no idea what they were doing in the background. My father completely manipulated me. He lied to me just like he repeatedly lied to you. I was terrified of his temper. I never wanted to leave you standing in the rain at that church. We can fix this, Nate. We can hire new lawyers and start over, just you and me." I stood there looking closely at the woman I had once willingly crawled through a blazing toxic inferno to save. I searched my own soul, expecting to feel a minor lingering sting of heartbreak, or perhaps a fleeting moment of hollow pity. I felt absolutely nothing. There was no remaining anger, no lingering sorrow, and certainly no trace of the blind, naive love that had almost gotten me killed. I looked at her with the absolute zero emotion of a senior forensic accountant finally closing a permanently balanced ledger. I calmly adjusted the left lapel of my dark charcoal suit, brushing away an invisible speck of dirt. "I am just a mid-level auditor making $80,000 a year, Caroline," I said, my voice perfectly steady and ruthlessly cold. "Your father is a brilliant corporate visionary. I am not going down with a loser." Her jaw dropped open in sheer absolute disbelief as her own venomous, cruel words were fed directly back to her. A guttural, desperate scream tore violently from her throat, echoing loudly over the ambient noise of the federal agents firmly reading Richard his Miranda rights. She fell to her knees on the polished floor, weeping uncontrollably as the true permanence of her situation finally settled into her bones. I did not turn around to offer a second glance. I gripped my heavy black leather briefcase securely in my right hand and walked smoothly out of the grand ballroom, leaving the entire Sterling family to burn slowly in the exact same toxic ashes they had explicitly prepared for me. 6 short months can completely redefine the entire trajectory of a human life. I am currently standing on the massive wraparound glass balcony of my new metropolitan penthouse, watching the vibrant city lights slowly flicker to life against the darkening twilight sky. The warm evening breeze carries the distant ambient hum of downtown traffic, a sound that feels remarkably peaceful compared to the roaring, chaotic inferno that once tried to swallow me whole. I take a slow, deep breath, filling my lungs with clean, crisp air. The severe physical burns covering my legs and arms have gradually faded into thick, textured scars. I do not hide them under heavy, long-sleeve shirts anymore. They are no longer painful, raw reminders of a terrifying, absolute betrayal. They are permanent, visible proof that I walked through a literal blazing fire and emerged completely unbroken. The federal justice system moved with an absolutely breathtaking velocity once they possessed the pristine, unadulterated evidence I provided. Special Agent Harris and his team completely dismantled the fraudulent Sterling empire in less than 3 weeks. Richard was dragged directly from his luxurious country club gala into a cold, sterile interrogation room where his towering arrogance finally shattered into a million pathetic pieces. The massive, highly publicized federal trial was an absolute media spectacle that thoroughly humiliated his entire bloodline. The strict federal judge showed absolutely zero mercy for a man who had stolen millions from his closest friends and deliberately tried to incinerate an innocent human being simply to cover his tracks. Richard is currently serving a mandatory 20-year sentence in a maximum security federal penitentiary. The brilliant visionary who once commanded elite boardrooms wearing $5,000 Italian suits is now assigned to mop the cafeteria floors wearing standard-issue prison orange. He will be an incredibly old, forgotten man long before he ever tastes fresh air again. Trent folded immediately under the aggressive federal pressure. He tearfully confessed to the premeditated arson and the incredibly botched cover-up, desperately hoping to secure a lighter sentence from the ruthless prosecutors. His cowardly cooperation earned him a decade behind thick concrete walls, completely stripped of the lavish trust fund lifestyle he arrogantly believed was his permanent birthright. But the absolute most profound example of systemic karma fell directly onto Caroline. She spent her entire adult life ruthlessly judging people by their banking balances, entirely convinced that her inherent superiority protected her from any real-world consequences. When the federal authorities seized every single remaining domestic asset to properly restitute the defrauded country club investors, Caroline was left completely financially naked. Her massive trust funds were immediately liquidated by the state. Her pristine luxury vehicles were abruptly repossessed in the middle of the night, leaving her stranded. Her expensive designer wardrobe was unceremoniously sold at public auction to satisfy the towering legal fees her family accumulated during their desperate failing defense. The woman who once looked me directly in the eyes and coldly stated she would never go down with a loser is now permanently anchored to an ocean of insurmountable debt. I recently heard through old social circles that Caroline is currently working grueling back-to-back double shifts at a cheap roadside diner just past the county line. Her flawless manicures are a thing of the distant past, completely replaced by hands blistered from harsh dish soap and carrying heavy greasy plates for minimum wage. She spends her nights wiping down sticky tables and serving the exact same working-class people she used to mock with absolute impunity. She gambled her entire soul on the pure illusion of inherited wealth and lost absolutely everything in the process. Meanwhile, my own reality shifted into a realm I never could have imagined while freezing inside a damp nylon tent. The State Department of Transportation honored the preliminary eminent domain contract without a single moment of legal hesitation. The heavy construction machinery officially rolled onto the toxic, ruined property, entirely paving over the ashes of my former life with thousands of tons of fresh, smooth highway asphalt. They successfully bypassed years of complex municipal litigation, and I received the massive $55 million acquisition payment directly into my secure private accounts. But I absolutely refused to take that staggering capital and quietly disappear onto a private tropical beach. I am a forensic accountant down to the very marrow of my bones. I thrive on bringing complex hidden truths directly into the blinding light. I used a significant portion of that massive government settlement to establish a highly elite private financial forensics firm located right in the absolute center of the commercial banking district. My corner office features towering glass walls that overlook the exact same financial institutions Richard once manipulated. My hand-picked team of aggressive, highly trained investigators specializes exclusively in hunting down massive corporate fraud. We actively dismantle predatory executives who firmly believe they are completely isolated above the strict parameters of the law. We rigorously trace the dark money, we aggressively crack the hidden offshore shell companies, and we hold the powerful strictly accountable. I effectively transformed the absolute worst trauma of my entire existence into a highly lethal professional weapon against extreme corporate corruption. The people who smile directly to your face while secretly plotting your absolute demise always make one fatal catastrophic miscalculation. They naturally assume your quiet, polite nature is a symptom of deep inherent weakness. They mistake your patient, steadfast loyalty for gullible stupidity. They became so incredibly used to casually walking all over me that they simply forgot I was the exact analytical man who actually built and balanced the very ledgers they were desperately trying to manipulate. They thought they buried me under the ashes, but they didn't realize I was the fireproof safe they couldn't crack. Sometimes the worst betrayal forces you to dig up the truth you were too comfortable to see. If you've ever been thrown to the wolves by people you loved, remember wolves leave bones, and bones can be sharpened into weapons. Drop a comment below if you've ever survived a betrayal that made you stronger, and subscribe to the channel for more stories about why you should never underestimate the quiet one in the room.